Hello. On behalf of Susan Weber, Director and Founder of the Bard Graduate Center, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Horowitz Book Prize Conversations on Access and Design. I am Peter Miller, Professor and Dean of the Bard Graduate Center. I'm a white male, age 57, with little hair and a head which my 11-year-old daughter and her friends, apparently, even more disconcertingly, describes as looking like an egg. I am speaking to you from the Bard Graduate Center on West 86th Street on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, once Mannahatta and still ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape people, Lenapehoking. We are also located just beyond what would have been and what were the furthest fields of Seneca Village, home of freed Blacks and immigrant Irish that was destroyed in the making of Central Park. On the screen, there is a photograph pulled from Google Street View of a suburban-looking brick house, almost obscured by a large tree with a driveway on the left. I'll come back to this image in a moment. The Horowitz Book Prize is offered annually to the best book on the decorative arts, design history, and material culture of the Americas. Previous prize-winning books have focused on Inca quipus and the slave ship icon. The prize offered to the winning author is this, an event of the author's design that is organized by the BGC for the author around the research presented in the book. Research begetting more research, which is what we at the Bard Graduate Center, a graduate research institute, believe in. Issues of accessibility and disability hide often in plain sight. And so, in addition to the obvious and crucial philosophical questions they raise about what is the human, what is normal, what do we mean when we say that every human is unique, there are specific challenges to the historian, those of us who work on the biographies of objects and the stories that these traces can involve. For instance, the building that's on the screen now looks like an ordinary suburban post-war house of the sort that Leave It to Beaver or any number of television programs have created stereotypes about. It happens to have a strange ramp built onto its structure. Some might look at this and wonder, and then wander off, paying no more attention to the subject. And others might say, with more perspicacity, that there was some attention being paid here to mobility issues, and perhaps leave it there. But for the biographer of the object, biography involving us humans by virtue of the use of the term, and recall that biography is often called a life, there's always more to it. And as I know, since I grew up in that house, and since my father built that house in 1947, and built that ramp for his eldest son who had cerebral palsy and could not walk, these as if archaeological traces are not about design as an art that is practiced, but as half of a dialogue that fated humans have with their material existence. And so long after the humans disappear, these material traces can enable us to reconstruct the other half of that silenced dialogue. And now it is my pleasure to call upon my colleague, Professor Catherine Whalen, to introduce the event more fully.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. I'm really delighted to be introducing Professor Bess Williamson today. Bess has been a friend and speaker at the Bard Graduate Center for some time, I think starting in 2014, where she shared her early work that led to this, that's part of this project, and more recently participated in a roundtable that we hosted last year on disability and design. I am associate professor here at Bard Graduate Center. I am a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair wearing black with a red scarf. Bess Williamson is Associate Professor of Art History, Theory, and Criticism at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She is a historian of design and material culture with a special interest in the social and political concerns in design. Here she foregrounds how environmental, labor, social justice, and rights issues shape and are shaped by spaces and things. She is also, as Peter has said, the recipient of this year's Horowitz Prize, known specifically as the Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Horowitz Book Prize for the best book on decorative arts, design history, or material culture, published in the Americas this year between 2019 and 2020. We are grateful to the Horowitz Foundation for providing this prize. This award recognizes her outstanding monograph, Accessible America, A History of Disability and Design, issued by New York University Press in 2019 as part of the series CRIP, New Directions in Disability Studies. Professor Williamson received a PhD in American Civilization and an MA in History from the University of Delaware, an MA in the History of Decorative Arts and Design at the Parsons School of Design, Cooper Hewitt, and a BA in History and Visual Arts at Brown University. In addition to authoring Accessible America, Professor Williamson is the co-editor with Elizabeth Guffey of Making Disability Modern, Design Histories, published by Bloomsbury in 2020. This anthology presents case studies of objects, buildings, and systems that reflect changing design approaches to disability from the 18th century to the present. Here, Professor Williamson also contributed a special section on digital culture with her study of 3D printed prosthetics in fashion and humanitarian design. She is also the author of numerous articles and reviews and a frequent lecturer at conferences and symposia like this one. The prize committee, comprised of myself and faculty members Meredith Lynn and Ivan Gaskell, greatly admired how Professor Williamson sensitively traces and interrelates the histories of disability and design in Accessible America. Her work is a compelling study of the relationships between people and things, in which she demonstrates how accessible design has shaped and continues to shape the world around us. Accessible America highlights not only the contributions of professional designers, but also by users who were not formally trained as such. Professor Williamson explains how these, what she calls consumer tinkerers, drew upon their own experiences as they adapted existing products and developed new ones. Furthermore, the book places its subject in clear relationship to histories of technology, architecture in the built environment, transportation, and medicine. Importantly, by examining the role of the state through legislation and government spending, often in response to civil rights activism, the book places its subject in a broad political context. It questions and addresses such issues as ableism, activism, inequality of access, and inclusion. Williamson's book also reframes disability as importantly visible rather than somehow ideally invisible, and as a means of knowledge making. Accessible America sets a new standard for the integrative discussion of disability and accessibility issues. And now, Bess.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thanks, Peter, for that great introduction. There is no better introduction for me than people sharing their personal photos and homes and sites of access. This is always really great to hear and see. So thank you, and thank you all out there in Zoom webinar land. Welcome to this day. I'm excited about some conversations that I've invited folks to have today, throughout the day. So I'll be talking with my colleague Amy Hamrai for the next 45 minutes or so about our books and our work in the history of access and design. At 11, we'll take a little break, and there will be another conversation between two scholars who have worked together and as well as worked with us a lot, Mara Mills and Jonathan Stern. And then we'll have a break for lunchtime, and at 1:30 Eastern time, I will rejoin the same Zoom. We'll sort of have that break like with no Zoom at all happening in the middle. And I'll join with a panel of artists and designers whose work has been really important to me in recent years: Riva Lehrer, Jennifer White-Johnson, and Josh Halstead. So I hope folks will come for parts of it that they can come into and out of, and the event is recorded and will be posted as well. So I'm Bess Williamson, a white middle-aged woman with brown and pink glasses sitting in my cluttered bedroom office. and I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, and in Chicago, the third largest urban Native American population in the United States. And I'm delighted also to be joined today by my colleague, friend and collaborator, Amy Hamrai. Amy is Associate Professor of Medicine, Health and Society and American Studies at Vanderbilt University and Director of the Critical Design Lab. Hamrai is author of Building Access, Universal Design and the Politics of Disability, and host of the Contra Asterisk podcast on disability, design, justice, and the life world. And they are a recent appointee to the U.S. Access Board and a 2022 United States Artist Media Fellow. And Amy will join me on the screen in about 15 minutes. I'm going to give a kind of spiel about my book, and particularly thinking about the ways that our books overlap. Amy and I met in graduate school and at particularly, I think, through the Society for Disability Studies and through some of our mentors and friends. And our work is, I always think of it as like two different voices telling very similar stories. We're sort of coming from different spaces intellectually, but used a lot of the same resources, same research sites, same oral histories, and met the same people in writing these two kind of parallel but different stories. So I'm always wanting to talk to Amy whenever possible, but I will touch on in sort of overview of some of the themes of my book, touch on some of its overlaps with Amy's as well. So I'm going to go into my slides here. This sepia tone slow shutter print of a wheelchair swooshing across the page has been in the background of a lot of my thinking about access and its history in the US. A wheelchair, so frequently the point of entry for thinking about access. The downward movement suggesting a ramp, that ubiquitous, if not always working or workable feature of accessible architecture. And the stop motion dragging speed that seems somehow joyful and free, despite the realities that access is often slow and difficult to achieve. This image was the inner cover of the illustrated handbook of the handicap section of the North Carolina State Building Code of 1974, an official document that was drawn and photographed by Ronald L. Mace, one of a small number of disabled licensed architects in US history. Mace was a wheelchair user who was disabled after childhood polio and wrote many of the first architectural guidelines for US government regulations in the 1970s through 1990s. He's credited also with coining the term universal design, a key term for design since the late 20th century that refers to the ideal of designing products and spaces for both disabled and non-disabled users without separation whenever possible. And universal design has a long legacy and kind of a complicated set of definitions, but Mace's early thinking about it, I think, is particularly distinctive in terms of thinking about, what is separate as opposed to what is shared when it comes to public space. The cover of Mace's book, so if we can imagine ourselves sort of reading like a large format paperback book, this is the inner printed cover of it. And this is the outer cover of it. Oh, not that, sorry. Perhaps presents a more familiar image of access, the large stick figure in a wheelchair, the easily recognizable international symbol of access that's sort of hovering or moving up a ramp that is drawn on top of a staircase. The ramp and wheelchair symbol seem to be heading toward a six-petaled flower or star shape that's on the landing, a symbol that Mace used throughout this handbook to mark design approaches that exceeded the minimum standards that were set by the state for making public spaces accessible. So it's a kind of asterisk to the building code as it existed in 1974. In thinking about these two images together, they represent two sides of the work of disability rights in the 20th century. The establishment and detailing of code with painstaking adjustments that were required to adapt a largely inaccessible world to its minimal requirements on one side of the page. but also the intangible feelings of movement and freedom that are so firmly established within US civil rights ideology, even if so challenging to achieve in practice. In the stop motion zoom of the wheelchair image may seem to include a more capacious interpretation than this kind of official looking image on the cover, as if he himself was sort of acknowledging that the codes had a more limited interpretation of access. Inside of the book, Mace included other images as well, other stop motion views of wheelchair users and crutch walkers navigating stairs and sidewalks. Here, the overlapping images of a wheelchair user being pulled up steps by a friend or assistant show access as a process that includes people, not just ramps and measured door clearance that were required by the codes. These photo illustrations seem to supply a reason for the code to exist, right? That disabled people were already in public spaces before accessible design, before ramps and entrances were added. Access was not an abstract question for Mace, of course, and it's not for some unknown population out there, but for those, his friends and colleagues that he photographed here. Mace's work is one of the areas where Amy's work and mine overlap. Amy's book, Building Access, Universal Design and the Politics of Disability, narrates the history of Mace, among other disabled designers and activists, thinking through access as a form of knowledge, drawing on their own experiences in physical space and with social and political institutions. And crucially, as Amy points out, the sites of research on accessible design were embedded within institutions of racial segregation and social hierarchy, including housing, higher education, and transportation. So even the public square that seems to be illustrated in this handbook evokes questions of whose public participation is supported in accessible design. Here we can imagine in 1970s Raleigh, North Carolina, not everyone is comfortable being, photographed in public or being in some of these public spaces. When I think of access, I'm thinking of this stair climb, slow and bumpy, and the help or collaboration that was likely fraught, maybe risky, or might be supportive that came with it. Like the swoosh of the opening wheelchair image, this image shows movement over and through the barriers of public space that very much still existed in this early time, and as we could say, still exists today. Another moment in this history that Amy and I both write about is in Berkeley, California, a place known for its histories of political protests and was a key site as well for the history of the US disability rights movement. In Berkeley, disabled people, pictured here on the cover of a publication from the Center for Independent Living, a grassroots social service agency that was founded in 1972. The image shows two wheelchair users being sort of pushed across a bricked sidewalk curb. On the far right is a white man with a beard with wearing a head cap that has a stick attached to it, used to navigate and to use his mechanical wheelchair, and he's being pushed by the floppy-haired, bearded assistant, and a young woman being pushed up by a wheelchair, perhaps by a man in a suit, perhaps a passerby. But on the far left of the photograph, it's barely visible, is another man standing and holding a white cane, showing us that this group of disabled activists who were mapping out their own community, trying to understand and project a more accessible way of moving through the city, are sort of working together across disability lines, wheelchair users and blind pedestrians in this group. This group, who were mostly former students from the University of California in Berkeley, launched a design project to revise and expand initial street level renovations that had been performed in the city after protests of the 1960s, right after the tear gassing of residents by the California state troopers under Governor Ronald Reagan. After these events, the city expanded sidewalks on Telegraph Avenue, the neighborhood kind of right next to the university, in recognition of the importance of public space. These new sidewalks included 5 corners of what were called by the city curb ramps. And this is an as-built drawing from the city that shows this curb, a quarter turn on the sidewalk with bricked crosswalks to the side of them. These ramps were noted by the disabled community and appreciated, but they were also edited over time. In particular, blind participants noted that these flattened out curbs, they were not really a curb cut in our current sort of familiarity, but simply a kind of flattening down of that quarter turn of the sidewalk. That these did not work well for blind folks, as they did not sufficiently mark the end of the sidewalk and the start of the street. In response, that team that in the earlier photograph, particularly Hale Zukas, designed a new curb cut that was installed on more than 100 curbs throughout the 1970s in Berkeley. So a shift from this quarter turn curb to a much sharper curb cut that existed outside of the crosswalk, that allowed the main walkway to remain accessible for blind walkers, but install this side curb cut. So this curb cut, exists as a sort of interesting artifact of Berkeley history, of the outcomes of this Cross Disability Alliance, of the sort of claim of expertise in design by this group of disabled city residents, but also of the compromises of accessible design, right? This is not the ideal outcome, a curb cut to the side of the walkway, but one that was seen as balancing the needs of multiple groups. And the curb cut is often cited as an example of the ease of universal design, right? It seems like such an elegant example. If you build a curb cut, it helps a variety of populations, right? We all use them: wheelchair users, strollers, carts, bikes. But the Berkeley story shows the friction of access, the back and forth between communities and the institutions that hold the power to design and build, and to maintain them over time. In this case, Zukas and others asserted themselves as design experts and worked in particular to require the city of Berkeley to include their input in future design renovations in the city. And over time, these ramps were replaced with the curb cuts that are more familiar to us today in the crosswalk, including either graded concrete or rubber bumps to mark the edge. But even these are not examples of great smoothness and universality, right? Those bumps themselves can be a barrier. As New Yorkers in particular know, we're here virtually, but we can pretend, some of us can happily pretend we're in New York instead. But unmaintained curb cuts turn into cliffs over potholes or patched asphalt in the street. In 2019, a lawsuit that was first filed in 1994, so 25 years earlier, was settled that required the city of New York to survey and ultimately repair thousands of missing and broken curb cuts. No word on how many of these have actually been completed, however. So these are some of the object examples that I describe in Accessible America to trace this history of access that's often uneven and conflicted. As a design scholar, I see the politics of access as evidence of design as a multifaceted thing, right? Not just an intentional planning process or not just the products that come out of it, but material outcomes that may land far from the initial plans of their builders. In other words, design doesn't only belong to designers. It belongs to the people who use it, who break it, who choose not to use it, and in best cases, end up loving and depending on it. And so I'll speak a little bit for the last few minutes here of kind of new research directions that I'm going on, and then I'll ask Amy to speak as well. So I've been looking more recently at other areas of design work, and these, sorry, my slides are not progressing quite right. There we go. That also exist sort of outside of professional firms and schools of architecture. Here I've been looking at the kind of design that's performed by care professionals, rehabilitation specialists, doctors, therapists, personal attendants, as well as the unpaid work of family and friend caregivers. One of the surprises of writing the book was noting the intensive tinkering and planning that was done outside of, that was done sort of inside of the medical and rehabilitation sphere, especially in the era before accessibility was widely mandated by law. So for example, in the book, I spent some time at the New York Institute of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, where in this photograph, a white coated professional oversees a woman in a wheelchair as she reaches into an oven mounted high up for her easy access. The kitchen bears the hallmarks of home economics and scientific management of the early 20th century, with its close-to-hand open shelving and its dish rack mounted above the sink. The kitchen may recall scientific management planning when figures such as Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, made famous by the book written by their children, Cheaper by the Dozen, filmed women typists and stenographers in their movements operating office equipment. Indeed, Lillian Gilbreth contributed to the design of this kitchen at the Institute. She was in her 70s by the time the Institute opened, and had designed a kitchen for the American Heart Association that she adapted for the Institute. The kitchen is designed closely around the movements of wheelchair-using women to allow them to return to what was referred to their profession, right, their gendered profession of homemaking. These women professionals, experts, and their patients, who were also predominantly women, show us a design process that focused in on the specific needs and skills of the home as a design world in itself. The professionals at the New York Institute and similar sites across the country developed and recommended tools that they saw as the key to, quote, independence, the autonomy of their patients in an inaccessible environment. They developed dozens of tools and adopted commercially available products like bent spoon handles for easier grips, or adding rubber sleeves and Velcro adjustable straps to everyday appliances. Developing design strategies of adaptation, what current day technology scholars call maintenance, right? Not inventing new things, but adapting and adjusting them to make them work. The particular design relationships that are inside of rehabilitation are fraught with power dynamics, right? As largely white educated women asserted normative standards for homemaking and self-care, right? Dressing, wearing makeup, and so on, onto disabled women. For the most part, these projects were not intended to be commercially produced or even replicated. They were bespoke, personalized approaches that were more likely to be delivered as instructions or catalogs, like this book, Living with a Disability, which was published by Howard Rusk, the director of the New York Institute, showing the many options that his staffers had developed. But there are exceptions to this design process that kind of remained outside of maybe the realm of commercial design. Later in the 20th century, designers, particularly male established designers, often entered into this world, whether to inform their own work, or in the case of Michael Graves, the architect, to design for themselves. Graves, who was a noted postmodernist architect and member of the 1980s Memphis group, became paralyzed in 2003 after a spinal infection. While still in the hospital being treated at the Kessler Institute for Rehabilitation in New Jersey, Graves began to plan interiors and product lines that he saw as incorporating a more design-conscious approach. His prototype for a shower cord and head, for example, which he prototyped under the brand name Michael Graves Solutions, incorporated colorful plastic casings and tactile buttons in a very similar look to his popular brand collaboration with Target that had come out just a few years before. Graves's work on medical products, which he continued over the years in collaboration with several different companies until his death in 2015, brings us from the world of friction and early accessible design to the bright and colorful, easily grabbable forms of contemporary product design. For many commentators, this move towards stylish, commercially viable products represented a form of design improvement in itself, right? The arrival of disability into the general marketplace. For others, this was often described as good design, a kind of common sense that could be found in its smooth surfaces and its departure from the medical and institutional. Critical access studies, so thinking back to Amy's work, helps us, I think, to assess these recent scripts about design as what Amy calls a self-evident common sense good. For me, putting these kinds of objects into context with the longer history of design within caregiving professions also suggests the way that design aligns with narratives around smoothness, ease, that are set in opposition to stigmas and differences around disability. The lack of easy fit, the misfit with design standards itself is, sort of a definition of disabled experience, right? Of the interaction with an environment that's not built for the non-standard self. These clean, bright objects, however, I find, to be kind of missing a part of them, right? That they show only part of the picture, this floating in space without the bodies and care relationships that show up in the more historical photographs of curb cuts and stairs. Without the people, design history tends to lose some of its material truth. So with those opening thoughts, I'm going to shift now and ask Amy to show up on our screen. Amy, are you out there? Hi, and I'm gonna hide myself and then show back up in a moment.
Hello, my name is Amy Hamrai. I use they, them pronouns. I appear on your screen as an olive-skinned Iranian transmasculine person. I have short, dark, curly hair and rectangular glasses. I'm wearing a black shirt and I'm in my office. There's some plants behind me and a whiteboard and a calendar. I'm joining you from the original homelands of the Cherokee and Chickasaw people, colonially known as Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm really excited to be here today to celebrate Bess's wonderful book. And I also just want to say that Bess is such a generous colleague, and it's been really great to know her for so long and to be in collaboration for so long. Many of the images that she showed in her slides were documents that she found in the archive and shared PDFs of with me when we were graduate students. And so I really respect and admire her intellectual generosity, and she's a great person to be in community with. And I'm really happy that we get to be here today celebrating her book. I'm going to show my slides now. So this is a bright yellow screen that has the words critical access studies on it and my name and title. And there's also a photograph on the screen that shows the disabled architect Ronald Mace, along with two other people who are standing, and Mace is seated in a wheelchair. They are in the lobby of a building labeled Taylor Business School. And they're kind of checking out the lobby. And on top of the image are some hand-drawn notations and suggestions for how to create an accessible vestibule for the lobby, including glass doors, light signals, call buttons for the elevator, etc. I really like this image because it gives us a little snapshot of what was happening in order to create the accessibility codes that Mace developed for North Carolina in that kind of sepia-toned set of images that Bess showed earlier. In the 1970s and 80s, architects like Mace were not only drawing on their lived experience, but also their professional training, like beginning to be able to go to architecture school as disabled people in very inaccessible conditions. And they were doing these experiments with accessibility. This was Mace's attempt to create an interior architectural form that didn't exist yet, that was taking different access needs into account. And so much of the history of access is like this, is experimental, and also involves disabled people's critiques of the existing built environment and efforts to create retrofits. So what I'm going to do today is just contextualize a field of research that is emerging that I've been calling critical access studies. And Bess's book is part of this. On this slide, I'm showing a very limited sample of books in this field. There are certainly many more that I could be showing here, but there are about 6, 7, 8 books shown here with titles like The Question of Access, Building Access, Accessible America, Designing Disability, Academic Ableism, Design Justice, Disability Space Architecture, and What Can a Body Do? And these are books that are part of a field that is getting away from some of the types of work that Mace and others were having to do in the 80s and 90s and in the 2000s, and away from the types of research that typically come from architects who are advocates for accessibility and trying to convince people who don't care about accessibility that they should care about it. That is a really important field of research. And also within critical disability studies, architectural and design history, and many other humanistic approaches, we're getting some critical approaches to accessibility, where scholars are asking questions like, who are we talking about when we talk about the user of access? Who benefits from this? Under what conditions? How do histories of disability and access intersect with histories of racism? What is the status of access codes versus more creative approaches that maybe come from disability culture? And so throughout these approaches, we are getting new vocabulary for talking about access and new questions that research can address as well. So some of the vocabulary of access traditionally includes accommodations, barrier-free design, compliance, consumers, employment, independence, retrofit, and the social model of disability, and also universal design. And on this slide, I'm showing images of a curb cut on a street with a pad that is yellow and plastic with raised bumps on it called tactile paving. I'm also showing a screenshot of an accessibility code that explains the required slope for a ramp. And then also on the right side, an image of an outdoor wheelchair ramp with aluminum guardrails and handles going up a kind of like concrete slope. And so the language of access tends to come from disability rights. And there's a lot of emphasis on accessibility being essential to creating better employment conditions so that disabled people can be independent and productive workers. And a lot of the codes and guidelines for accessibility within this context have to do with retrofitting or changing the existing built environment, as well as creating new ones. There's also an emerging vocabulary of critical access that takes a pretty different approach. So I have a lot of text on this slide. I'm not going to read all of it, but just to point out a few concepts and theories that are emergent. The hashtag access for ableds, which came about during the pandemic when suddenly all of these forms of remote and digital participation were available when non-disabled people needed them, but had been denied to disabled people before. The hashtag access is love, framing access as relations and hospitality, not just compliance. Access fatigue, the concept from Annika Conrad that seeking accommodations uses a lot of energy and therefore disadvantages disabled people. Access washing, a concept from the late disability justice activist Stacey Park Milburn, that's about how sometimes enforcing the ADA is used as a pretext for criminalizing unhoused people. collective access, a model that is based on disabled people creating access for each other rather than relying on the state. Within this kind of framework, we also have critical access studies. As I mentioned before, Meryl Alper has also contributed critical access media studies. And Bess, along with our colleague Elizabeth Guffey, has written about the design theory of disability in their book, Making Disability Modern, which is awesome. Everyone should read it. Liz Jackson has this great concept of the disability dongle, the types of technologies that non-disabled people create for disabled people that are pretty useless, but that are assumed to be necessary. And of course, many more concepts here. Another set of concepts in critical access studies comes from scholars interested in technology specifically. And Bess is one of those people who I think does really great work that bridges architectural design and product design, industrial design, et cetera. And so in her work, there's quite a lot of emphasis on design by disabled people. And she showed some of those kind of hacks and technologies in some of her slides. On my slide, I'm showing a screenshot from Katrin Lynch and Sarah Hendren's project, Engineering at Home, that is this kind of plastic or silicone clear cover with like grippies on it holding a fork. And this is a project that documented the adaptations that a disabled woman made in order to navigate all the stuff that she needed to do without using assistive technologies that were being provided in a kind of medical framework. There are a number of other concepts that are emerging within this field to describe design by disabled people and how that is political. So Remy Yurgo's cryptastic hacking, Kelly Fritsch and I have written about cryptechnoscience, Arceli Dokumachi's microactivist affordances. And then also the vocabulary of critiquing technology and its ties to the medical industrial complex. And I really like Ashley Shu's term techno-ableism for that. So I'm just going to briefly touch on how critical frameworks can inform how we talk about universal design, which is a concept that emerged in the mid-1980s to describe the idea that design that benefits disabled people also benefits non-disabled people. And I want to explain how this concept has shifted and changed often in ways that are out of alignment with the original politics that it was trying to contain. And I should mention that this concept was introduced by Ronald Mace, who I showed on the first slide. So I have a number of images here that come from Ronald Mace's working archives, as well as the work that he produced as he was thinking about the concept of universal design. The way that he wrote about it originally was that there are a lot of disabled people, they're a powerful constituency, they have a lot of buying power and also a lot of political power. And this was before the ADA, about 5 years before. And so he was trying to explain to architects that therefore, it would behoove architects to design for disabled people as a matter of justice. And that if they were to do this, it would benefit people who also appear to be non-disabled. And so one of the designs that his theory was based on is the one that I'm showing on the left. This is an advertisement for an architectural drafting table called the Huey Saturn. It's named after the Black Panther, Huey Newton. And it says, the identical, unique Huey Saturn student station trains handicapped and unhandicapped with equal ease. And the images on the advertisement show two people who certainly in the 1980s and also probably today are very underrepresented in the architecture field. So there's kind of androgynous presenting white woman architecture student up on the left-hand side, and then a Black man who's a wheelchair user and also a student. He has an afro and a beard on the right side, and they're both using the same table, drafting table. And part of the argument here was to say that design for disability also benefits non-disabled people, but also to draw attention to the different ways that barriers in and around architecture are operating. And so this advertisement is highlighting race and gender, for example, as part of it. It's also reproducing some of the kind of norms around race and gender that later were problematized by Black feminists. For example, here demonstrating womanhood as whiteness and Blackness as maleness. Also on this slide are some images from some of Mace's later architectural handbooks and guides that are kind of challenging typical representations of the architectural user, even the disabled architectural user. So we have a kind of composite photograph of his wife, Lachlan, who is also a wheelchair user, going up a ramp. So it looks like a bunch of photos imposed on each other. There is a drawing of a person who possibly appears to be a blind Black woman using a white cane to go down a street. And then one that I always find kind of weird and interesting, which is an explanation for why full-length mirrors are a form of universal design. And it says, full-length mirrors work well for everyone. And there are 4 figures in front of a mirror: a woman who's standing and who appears to be a woman of color, a man who's seated, also appears to be a man of color who's seated in a wheelchair, and then a young white girl, and then a poodle. And there are people of different heights, and kind of this like trying to be a representation of diversity, I guess, and to include children and non-human animals as part of universal design. And they're all looking into the same full-length mirror. So from this, we can kind of get a sense of how architects like Mace were trying to grapple with the issue of diversity within the category of disability in the 1980s. But of course, our social discourse at that time was also not super refined around these things. In the late 1990s, Mace and his collaborators at the Center for Universal Design created the principles of universal design. And here I'm showing a poster that has, it's in this kind of like chartreuse and hot pink color palette. It lists the different principles, and next to them has images illustrating the principles. So for example, one of them is tolerance for error, and the image shows kind of Word document, computer screen, someone's about to click undo, or perceptible information shows someone using a thermostat with enlarged print on it. These principles came about 7 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act emerged to require architects to engage in certain forms of accessibility. And unlike Mace's original definition of universal design as design for disability benefits non-disabled people, these principles took a more disability neutral approach. And there's really not a lot of disability iconography or representation, visually or otherwise here. What they were basically trying to do was to create some standards or values that architects could use to go beyond the code and draw on principles from product design and assistive technology. And at the same time, this had a lot of implications for the way that universal design eventually came to be distanced from disability. So as an example, I got to visit the Universal Design Living Laboratory outside of Columbus, Ohio a few years ago. shown here. It's a very large suburban craftsman style home. I think it's about 7,000 square feet. It has a covered driveway and kind of a natural stone exterior. And this home is, it's lived in by a disabled woman and her non-disabled husband, but it's also kind of a showroom for luxury accessibility products that are integrated throughout. And so part of what has happened to the discourse of universal design, and it's getting away from a civil rights context, is that accessibility has come to be marketed as a luxury amenity for people who can afford to live in single family homes and have these objects that look kind of just like everything else that would be in this kind of like builder created home. So I want to contrast this with critical access methods and approaches that are emerging in the last 10 or 15 years from within disability culture. And these are approaches that come from disabled artists and designers and people who are doing disability design as part of their everyday lived experience. On this slide, I'm showing like a diagram protocol that I drew a few years ago for a project called Mapping Access. Yeah, so just to say that a lot of the work that comes out of critical access studies is more focused on design that generates questions rather than design that is purely functional. And so this protocol lists a bunch of questions that came about from a process of trying to do accessibility mapping that included what counts as access for whom, how do we map it, you know, how do we change institutional policies and things like that. So I won't go that too far into it, but here I'm showing some images from the Mapping Access project, including some participants measuring a building, like an event poster for an accessibility mapathon, and also a checklist that was created for this. And this project was inspired actually by a historical map that Bess found in the archives that showed how the early disability rights movement in Berkeley used mapping as a way to draw attention to how inaccessible the city was. And we basically replicated that process as an experiment at Vanderbilt to try to get the university to pay attention to how inaccessible the campus was. And it was very successful, and it led to a 40-year accessibility master planning process. And this is an example of how disability history and culture can inform our present practice. Okay. I think I skipped a slide. Okay, another project that we have been working on during the pandemic is called Remote Access. It's a crip nightlife gathering, essentially a dance party. And here I'm showing the announcement page for it and also a screenshot of a tweet that is kind of talking about the dance party and showing it on a Zoom screen. And on the Zoom screen is art from the disabled artist Yo-Yo Lin, and then a number of little boxes with people's faces in them. And this is a party that uses all of the different methods from disability culture, like image description, sound description, ASL captioning, as ways that people can participate when they're in the digital space together. And then finally, a project that is using disability culture to think about design and world making is an art exhibition called Crip Ritual that is up at 2 galleries in Toronto right now. And there's a virtual exhibition that you can also visit. It's www.cripritual.com. And I'm showing the announcement for the exhibition and the screenshot of the website on the screen, which includes a photograph by the artist Hannah Sheehan that looks kind of like a honeycomb. And this is taken through a monocular lens that she uses for accessibility and then also for photograph taking. So I'm going to stop here and just say that you can learn more about these projects at the website mappingaccess.com, and that they're just part of a broader and evolving field of critical access studies.
And thank you, Amy, for that ranging overview. And I think particularly, I don't know, I was particularly interested in sort of the vocabulary. One of the things that I also note is that ideas around disability, technology, access are, you know, maybe this goes without saying, but are so like not limited to the academic world, and that there's so much of a kind of constant going back and forth or sort of conversation in the culture broadly, right? As we pay attention to these, you know, new technologies that seem to promise a lot, but deliver a little, but also, you know, obviously in our kind of current moment, there's such an active discussion of kind of the politics of health and how we are responding in our own communities, that it's so hard not to see those connections, I think, between the historical collective actions that we're talking about and the current day. Speaking of politics, politics with a capital P, I'll just read the question that has come in here from Zach. During the 2020 elections, I received complaints that the door width to the bathrooms at poll sites were too narrow for wheelchairs. When I spoke to representatives from the New York Board of Elections, they said that it was little they could do because of their focus on poll site accessibility and that bathrooms were a separate issue. How can accessibility be guidelines be used to retrofit all areas? You know, I can't speak to with any like great expertise to the specific situation, but I think it just, you know, points out so many of the divides that exist between kind of the letter of access and the spirit that we would understand that of course a poll site is not separate from the site that it's in, even if it's maybe governed by different guidelines. Amy, do you want to comment on that?
I guess I can just say really quickly that this is a problem that's produced by the very technical approach to accessibility that says bathrooms are one kind of technical problem, polling machines are a different one, and that like the site itself doesn't encompass both, which would be more of a kind of like social and humanistic understanding of access. And it does seem a little weird to me that they would make that distinction. And I can see also how there might be confusion around it just because the standards are separate.
Yeah. It also just, you know, I think maybe it also bears mentioning the kind of double-edged sword of having standards is that then they can also be used as a reason why access is denied, right? It's like, oh, well, it's not in the standard, so therefore we have no responsibility for it. But I want to move to this other question, which I think is very provocative as well. From Marin Lynette, I'm very interested in how universal design is no longer about what May saw it as. What do mainstream architects and designers think universal design is about and who it is for? I would definitely recommend a close look at Amy's book for this, but I think it's really relevant also, I think, to conversations that we've had for many years. And I always feel a kind of personal like possessiveness or defensiveness about universal design, that it's used kind of overly broadly. But then again, I think that sometimes it's kind of encoded in the name. Like I think Mace wrote about this, that he distinctively used this term because it was more, it sounded like something that everyone should be doing for his fellow architects, right? Before he and others kind of really coined the term, he was using the business name barrier-free architects, which I always think like barrier-free just does not sound as exciting as universal design. But as a result, it sometimes does get a little overly broad, and suggests in particular what I hear from both proponents and critics is this idea of kind of one size fits all. Right, the idea that there is a single design that can really serve everyone. And I think Mace recognized that that was not true. He often wrote about cross disability kind of access conflicts. But you know, but also that I think it's very important that universal design is not like an endpoint or like a single magic solution, because I think there are many situations, particularly when that might exclude populations who are sort of not accommodatable by a physical solution, right? And we can see that you cannot always build access as an object. Sometimes it has to really be integrated into kind of policies and practices, or what Amy called protocols there. Amy, do you want to expand on that or discuss?
Yeah, sure. So I agree with everything you said, Bess. And I guess the only thing I would add is like, there are when we're advocating for something, there are the things that we want to happen and the things that we say to try to convince other people to make that happen. And the term universal design was part of an experiment to see if they could get certain things to happen that barrier-free design was not producing. And people kind of took it and did other things with it that were beyond or sometimes opposed to the original intention. And that was part of the tension around the concept that like, it was supposed to help disabled people count as part of the universal. And then it became this kind of neutralizing force. And so I think when I talk to mainstream architects and designers today, a lot of people say like, oh, universal design, and they think about design for aging or something like that. They're definitely not thinking about disability in a very broad or capacious or even politicized way. And that's very different within like disability justice communities, where we do talk about universal design frequently, and we demand that access be built in for a broad range of people, and tend to be more politically oriented that way. It's kind of a like difference in whether or not disability is understood as something that is this kind of like large, unstable, and yet I don't want to say accommodatable, but like a category that can be included within our existing built environments.
Thanks so much, Amy. I think I'll bring us to our pause there. We will reconvene at 11:15 with Jonathan Stern and Mara Mills. So take a little break and we'll be back. I'm Bess Williamson. Happy to be rejoining you all for this conversation between two scholars whose work has been really informative to me, but to the broader field of disability studies. In particular, I will admit, I invited Jonathan and Mara partly because their work exists in kind of a different areas of accessibility studies in that I didn't really touch on that much, which is to say the worlds of sound and vision. So I will introduce you to and let you speak. First, Mara Mills is Associate Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University. She's a co-founder and editorial board member for the journal Catalyst, Feminist Theory, Technoscience. Most recently, she's co-editor of Testing Hearing, The Making of Modern Orality, CRIP authorship, Disability as Method, which is under contract from NYU Press, and a special issue of Osiris on disability and the history of science, which will be out next year. With Jonathan Stern, she's writing a book on the history of time stretching. She's co-founder and co-director of the NYU Center for Disability Studies, where she's currently co-directing the NSF-funded project, How to Be Disabled in a Pandemic, with Faye Ginsberg, Harris Kornstein, and Raina Rapp. Joining Mara this morning is Jonathan Stern, who teaches in the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at McGill University. He's author of Diminished Faculties, A Political Phenomenology of Impairment, just out months ago from Duke University Press, MP3, The Meaning of a Format, and The Audible Past, Cultural Origins of Sound Reproduction from 2003. And I just want to note how early that book was in terms of being before many of the books that we're talking about today, in terms of really joining sound studies more generally with the history of deafness, and numerous articles on media technologies and the politics of culture. He's also editor of the Sound Studies Reader and co-editor of the Participatory Condition in the Digital Age. He's working on a series of essays on artificial intelligence and culture. And with Mara Mills, he's writing Tuning Time, Histories of Sound and Speed. You can see his website at sternworks.org, which includes many useful bits of information, including how to run a hybrid Zoom graduate seminar, which remains very useful to many of us. All right, Jonathan, Mara, I'll stop talking. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Bess. Can everybody hear me? Okay, so Mara and I are going to try to tag team this a little bit and go back and forth. So I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes. Mara's going to talk for a little less than 10 minutes because she's going to play you some sound files later, which should be cool and mix things up. So let me just get my script in front of me. Okay, so hi, I'm Jonathan. Greetings from Chochage, or so-called Montreal. I want to begin by congratulating Bess on the Horowitz Prize. Your work and Amy's has been so important for my own thinking on disability and technology, and I am old enough to remember teaching disability studies before Amy Hamray and Bess Williamson, and I like it better after. So this is me. I am a masculine presenting person with a hairdo not dissimilar to Peter Miller's, a little more gray on the temples. I'm wearing a sort of, I don't even know what color this is, sort of peachish shirt. I have, we call it white, but it's really pinkish skin. And I'm wearing blue tortoiseshell glasses from the rare blue tortoise. In my background to my left is a piece of cloth with a sound wave on it, and that sound wave is supposed to be a cat purring. And to my right in the background is a giant stuffed unicorn named Mr. Twinkles, the COVID unicorn. And in the distance, you can also see a stuffed Kermit the Frog turned towards the wall, and he is actually enthusiastically greeting a picture of my two cats that you cannot see. Okay, so that's what you would be looking at if you were looking at it. So another aspect of this symposium that seems to be taking shape is a celebration of intellectual friendship. I did a little counting this morning, and I realized that Mara and I have been friends for 19 years now. And certainly it's hard for me sometimes to distinguish my own ideas about sound, technology, and disability from hers, because we have been in dialogue in so many ways for so long. And I'm going to use my time to talk about my new book, Diminished Faculties, A Political Phenomenology of Impairment, which I'm holding up here. It's just out from Duke University Press, and it really tries to wrestle with this idea of impairment. There's a tradition in disability studies of writing about impairment as like the physical or material substrate of disability. But I've been thinking about it quite differently. In part, this is shaped by Mara, who has written about how impairment was an engineering concept at the turn of the 20th century that was later mapped onto people. And engineers thought about impairments, especially communication impairments, as something sort of inherent to media systems like the telephone, and something that, rather than being eradicated, something that would be relational, something that would be negotiated. So Diminished Faculties in part tries to do for impairment what critiques of the sex-gender binary have done in feminist, queer, and trans theory, which is to say maybe this term that we thought was like the natural substrate of a cultural construct is in fact itself something that is constructed and historical. So it is notoriously hard for an author to summarize a recently published book, especially one that doesn't follow a traditional arc, which is the case of Diminished Faculties. But I'm going to give it a go here. So the story of the book can be told in three ways, and I will tell it in three ways. The first is that the book is an impairment phenomenology. For those of you not familiar with the term phenomenology, you could describe it as the philosophical study of or description of experience, or you could go even further and say that phenomenology tries to describe the conditions of possibility for experience. And what this book tries to do, I guess you could say, is to crip phenomenology, to provide a flip side within disability studies to what I would call an affirmative dimension of disability, where disabled experience, which is so often left out of mainstream discussions of design, of architecture, of culture, communication, technology, media, is brought in and described and affirmed. But we can also take disability theory to heart, that experience might not be transparent to itself. And this is especially important for what Chris Bell would have jokingly called white disability studies, which is to say the sort of mainstream frames about disability that we are still very much struggling with in the field. So what would it mean to interrogate the evidence of experience and to interrogate the idea that simply having an experience makes it fully available to your consciousness? So that's the sort of big philosophical thing. The book is, second, you could say, a phenomenology of not speaking well, not hearing well, and not feeling well, three things with which I have a good deal of practice and experience, and I know others do too. And the book is, in this case, part phenomenology, but also I bring in work from the history of science and technology, disability studies, disability and design, practice-based research, the arts, and cultural studies. And then the third way to tell the story of the book is to dig into the way I approach voice, hearing, and fatigue, and introduce a concept from each section, and I will do that now. So the first part of the book is about voice. When scholars who write on sound and voice and also music and speech generally talk about voices, they talk about them as expressions of intent, of agency, of interiority, of subjectivity. Think about the metaphoric use of a term like voice to describe the intent of a social group in politics, you know, the voice of the people, for instance, the way that feminist scholars often use voice to describe the self-assertion or agency. And instead, I want to write about voice as sort of a problem rather than a solution, as something in need of prosthesis, support, and care. And this is the part of the book that's probably most closely tied to my own experience. When I describe myself, I did not include actually the technologies with which I am using to communicate with you. I am using a microphone, which you can sort of see off to the edge here. It is, I mean, it just basically looks like a big fluffy orb in the picture. And I'm also wearing headphones, and that's because I have a paralyzed vocal cord, and this allows me to hear my own voice and not blow it out. And this is very important. Around my neck, I'm wearing another technology, which in the book I refer to as the Dorko Phone. It is a small, it just appears as a small black square in a fake leather pouch in front of you. And this kind of technology is called a personal portable speech amplifier. And this is what I normally use in seminar talks or in public speaking settings where I'm not using a public address system, again, to sort of amplify my voice and make it available to people. Here's another one not in a pouch. This one is called the Mini Buddy by ALDS, and it actually even has a port for a USB stick on which you can put MP3s. So there's a callback to one of my earlier books. So what does it mean to have speech in need of prosthesis or support? Well, simply compare something like this device, the Dorko Phone, around my neck with something like my glasses. One is constructed as a fashion accessory, and it is understood as something that is normal in relation to impairment. The other raises questions, right? The voice comes from my chest rather than my mouth. And it suggests, how should I put this? It accessorizes disability, it externalizes it, it makes it visible in ways that it might not otherwise be audible. The section of the book on hearing deals with, let's call it a concept of normal impairments. And for those of you in disability studies, you might think of this as the flip side of the coin to Robert McGruer's idea of compulsory able-bodiedness. The argument of that section is that many modern environments are actually designed for people that are a little bit hard of hearing, and even actively produce it. And so rather than treating some hearing loss as something that is undesirable or hardness of hearing as a problem, instead that section of the book really takes seriously, like, what if we think about this anthropologically, and what do we say, well, how do we find a way to describe cultural practices that impair the people doing them and that actually preferred impaired people in them. The last section of the book deals with fatigue and brings with it the idea from disability studies that disability can be something that is productive rather than absence. When people talk about fatigue, and this is true in disability studies, this is true in industry and management theory, and it's also true in medical science, fatigue is usually described as the absence of energy. And in this section of the book, I write a history of that idea of fatigue as absence, but also say, how might we understand it as a presence or a quality of experience, and even as a kind of political demand. So that's basically what the book covers. There's more to say, and I am slowly working on this book with Mara that we might get some time to talk about. But that's my introduction, and now over to you, Mara.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. I'm going to share my screen and show a couple slides. Let's see if this is working. Okay. So it's so fun to be here with everyone. And Jonathan, it's great. It's been a little while. We've done a lot of co-presentations, but I think it's been about a year, and it's wonderful to do this again. Thanks so much for the invitation, Bess. I want to just start by saying that yesterday, as I was putting together my comments for this conversation, and also on the side, like multitasking and looking at Twitter, I noticed that Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarashina announced that a PDF of disability justice and audit tool was now available for download as a PDF. So of course I immediately downloaded it and read through it, and I'm looking forward to using it and teaching it. This slide, my first slide, has a photo of the cover, which looks like a classic composition notebook with a black and white marbled cover and a pink queer crip sign in the bottom right corner. I should just say, since I didn't describe myself, and my little image is on your screen too, I am a middle-aged white feminine presenting person. I've just put on some glasses. I have brown hair pulled up in a bun, a black shirt. I'm sitting in front of a white wall with an object I found on the street, which is a kind of like some children's toy that you could take photos with your head behind, and also a white Christine Sun Kim drawing that looks like a Venn diagram. So one of the things that interested me right away about the disability justice audit tool that I'm featuring on this first slide, I wanted to feature it first, is that the authorship of this handbook is listed as both Leah as the writer and Stacy Milburn, who Amy Hamre mentioned, as the envisioner of the book. And on one of the opening pages, which I quote on this slide, Leah writes, "Stacy died before we could start working on this tool, and I wish so much that she were here to work on it with me. However, creating and editing this audit tool the way we did it, collaboratively, at the pace of our bodies and minds, taking in feedback and learning from the bumps, is very much in keeping with the way Stacy practiced disability justice organizing." So Leah's practice of collaboration and citational justice, a term that I learned from design theorist Liz Jackson, Leah's practice of collaboration and citational justice as CRIP authorship coincides, I think, or it really felt that way yesterday and today to me, with the way Bess Williamson has choreographed this celebration in honor of her book. And I'm going to focus my part of the opening part of our conversation on a couple of my own collaborations this year and the ways they've been influenced by Bess's work. So I want to start with one of Bess's own collaborations with Elizabeth Guffey on their co-edited volume, Making Disability Modern, published by Bloomsbury in 2020, which collects a dozen or so historical accounts of design by and with disability. And as editors, they precipitate out inductively in their introduction what they call a design model of disability, which we've heard about in the previous conversation, that cuts across all of the cases in the book. This slide shows the teal colored cover of the book, featuring a smiling white woman in a wheelchair with a colorful pink, purple, and yellow wheel. The design model, Williamson and Guffey write, defines disability through function in material and increasingly digital environments. As compared to medicine and the medical model of disability, design, here's another quote from them, does not envision bodily cure or rehabilitation as the only response to disability. Instead, it delivers agency to material and increasingly digital artifacts by imagining that objects and spaces can do the work of inclusion. Architecture, design, and engineering manage populations and set the terms for bodily capacity in ways distinct from medicalization, but no less far-reaching. Yet they remind us by the end of their introduction, mainstream and corporate design is, quote, not a cure-all for eliminating prejudice, social awkwardness, and exclusion. And of course, we heard that in Bess's and Amy's opening comments. For that, we need Sasha Costanza-Chalk's design justice theory and practice, and Amy Hamry and Kelly Fritch's cryptechnoscience as activist and community-based responses, revisions, and rejections of the corporate design model. So I've been using Bess and Elizabeth Guffey's edited collection as a model for one of my own current collaborations with Jaypreet Verdi and Sarah F. Rose as we co-edit the 2023 issue of Osiris, one of the flagship journals of the History of Science Society, on the topic of disability and history of science. The three of us have been troubled over the past several years by the much slower uptake of disability studies into history of science as compared to histories of medicine, technology, and design. Disability still rarely appears as explicit subject or object in histories of science. It neither seems to be a property of scientists or the scientific method in the canon of the field, nor a topic of investigation, especially outside the human sciences and applied sciences, especially not in the so-called hard realms of physics, chemistry, astronomy, geology, and so on. When disability does appear, it's rarely named as such. And more importantly, the broad disability framework, critical terminology, and social historical methods of disability studies tend to be absent. The situation is slowly changing, as you can see from this graph on the current slide that I'm showing that Jaypreet Verdi created, counting the number of talks offered at the annual History of Science Society meeting related to disability studies over a decade. So the slide shows a relatively steady increase from maybe 2 talks in 2011 to about 38 in 2021. But I have to say, we really had to fluff these numbers. Like, not all of the authors in the 38 explicitly referenced disability or disability studies. We got kind of desperate in this count and added, we basically counted talks that even referred to disability as subject matter. So this is not very scientific, but it gives you a sense of what's happening in the field of history of science. In writing the introduction to that Osiris volume, we give some explanations for why the history of science has been such a latecomer. I'll leave that till next year for you to read. But we also thought a lot about Bess Williamson and Elizabeth Guffey's design model of disability and their inductive method of coming up with it as editors. And we've placed it alongside a cluster of other models that activists and scholars have proposed recently as alternatives to the medicalization thesis to explain the modern conception and management of disability. Many people in this audience will know that an early wave of disability scholars drew on the insights of anti-medicalization critics from the 1970s, people ranging from Irv Zola to Ivan Illich, Michel Foucault, emphasizing the roles of physiology and healthcare in defining and segregating the so-called normal and the pathological between the late 19th and mid 20th centuries, the period most closely identified with the rise of medicine and medicalization. Second generation medicalization theorists, people like Peter Conrad, acknowledge that medicalization is not driven by medicalization alone. So market forces, laws, the pharmaceutical industry, engineering, insurance have played as much of a role as physicians and hospitals. Following Bess and Elizabeth's intervention, it's clear that an overemphasis on the medicalization thesis, as important as it is, has led to the neglect of other scientific and technical discourses, as well as the conundrum of incompletely medicalized or unmedicalized disabilities. So rather than stretch Western medicine to cover every instance of disablement and its regulation, and here these models are, the models I'm discussing here are regulatory, managerial models, not more bottom-up activist ones, of which there are tons. Scholars have started to look at other structures and epistemes, and I'll just mention two more. An important one that I think should be cited more is Marta Russell's from her 1998 book, Beyond Ramps, Disability at the End of the Social Contract, where she urged the field of disability studies to think in terms of a money model of disability under which, and these are her words, the disabled human being is a commodity under which social policies are created or rejected based on their market value. And here are some examples of what she means are that decisions about who is institutionalized, for instance, say in a nursing home, are made by Medicaid policymakers and nursing home managers concerned with profits. Likewise, decisions about who receives life insurance or workers' compensation are as likely to be made by actuaries as by physicians. In fact, probably more so likely to be made by actuaries. And then as a last example of one of these models that we've been thinking alongside, like the design model, last month, theorist and activist Alex Haggard published a piece on the Platypus blog on what they call the complicated model of disability, which I see as drawing these other models together, envisioning them as a sort of network. And Haggard writes, disability is a state of ontological negation that society enacts against those whose existence is characterized as detrimental to society. It is likely that a person will encounter multiple modes of negation throughout their life and within different contexts. The combination and predominance of the modes that they are subjected to will shape their particular experience of ableist oppression and disabled identity, as well as their needs and priorities with regard to political organizing. So Jay and Sarah and I have been working with our 15 or so Osiris authors whose articles span the globe and the ancient and modern worlds to try to distill a parallel argument about the ways science has defined, counted, and regulated disabled lives. We spend some time in the introduction asking what does the word model mean. I'm not going to rehash that here, but I'll just say that based on the cumulative insight collected in our volume, we argue, and really based on the model that Bess and Elizabeth have given us for being editors and doing the work of writing an introduction, we argue that a scientific management model of disability is another crucial node in that network, in Haggard's network. Perhaps unlike the medical and design models, we were surprised to find a scientific management model of disability that having roots in ancient empires, namely the control of enslaved people and mass labor. And here we especially draw on the work of blind historian and archaeologist Eric Harvey. Scientific management, of course, was accelerated by the science of statistics and tools of automated computing in the late 19th century, but it long precedes the work of Frederick Winslow Taylor, with which the phrase is often associated. We have to look at it in the roots of racial capitalism and even before capitalism in other kinds of empires. So I'll leave that as a teaser for the publication of the volume next year, and just say that in the meantime, I'm really looking forward to continuing writing alongside the design model of disability and these other models in the upcoming months. So let me turn back to my other collaborator, Jonathan Stern. I don't think Jonathan and I have ever proposed a model, but we do have we've done a lot of longstanding work. My God, I didn't know it had been 19 years. I did meet you as a grad student, and I was very lucky to have a mentor like you, and now a collaborator. We've done a lot of work on the ways disability and media are co-constituted, a phrase we use all the time, a very STS-y kind of phrase. In our epilogue to the collection Disability Media Studies, edited by Elizabeth Alcessor and Bill Kirkpatrick in 2017 for NYU Press, we used the term dismediation to theorize media change and technical design from a disability studies perspective and also a disability activist perspective. Dismediation, we wrote in that piece, and this is a quote, refuses universal models of media and communication. It takes disability as method, not simply as content for media studies. So Jonathan, in your new book, Diminished Faculties, you turn, as you said, from disability to impairment and impairment's relationship to media and design. Maybe not so coincidentally, I should say that I am doing a lot of rethinking of impairment myself for the Osiris issue. Dan Book, a historian of the census and life insurance, he and I co-authored, and I should say he's very much the first author, an article on the history of impairment as it came out of the life insurance industry. And what a grim set of readings that was. So I've been doing a lot of work on rethinking impairment too, and that'll be out next year. I really loved and was surprised to see you conclude this book. Even though it was unusual, I was still surprised to see that it ended with an epilogue that's a user's guide. And it's a user's guide to a theory. So I'm showing a slide here with 2 pages from that epilogue. It's designed to look like a user's guide, complete with lists and illustrations. And I've thought a lot about what is a user's guide to a theory. It implies that a theory can be an artifact of complex design. So why did you decide to create this user's guide, and how in your theory is impairment a design tool? How do you spell out impairment as a design tool?
First, I must unmute myself. Thank you. Thanks, Mara. And for those that maybe don't see Mara's slide here, it's was a couple pages from the conclusion to Diminished Faculties, which is set inside the book. So it looks like you're looking at a physical instruction manual, sort of like on a table or something. And then the layout actually follows the sort of style of instruction manual. So there's illustrations, although some of them are decorative. I worked with the artist Darsha Hewitt, of whose work I'm a big fan. So there's a glib answer, and then there's a more serious answer, and I'm going to give both of them to you. So the glib answer is that the user's guide was never supposed to be there. And this is because I wrote the book that the last thing that happens in the final in the fatigue chapter is that I pass out on my bed and a cat throws up on me. And that's how I wanted the book to end, as sort of an undermining of the masterful authorial subject. But all the readers said you need a conclusion. And so I went and looked at a bunch of conclusions to books. And the scholarly conclusion is like let's just call it an underdeveloped genre. There are a few good examples, usually at the end of books that don't have introductions. And then the conclusion serves the use of the introduction. So I thought, well, what can this do? Like, conclusions are usually like further thoughts or where things should go. And I said, well, what if I tried to abstract a set of principles from the book that could lead people in their own practice, or like help them guide their own practice, or they could look at them and resist them and come up with their own approaches. And so it actually involved a lot of work. I had to say, well, what is a theory? I mean, I think a lot of what passes for theory in scholarship is actually just commentary on other texts that people call theory. It's like a textual exegesis. Whereas I think a theory is a new description of the world. And that's how you can have an impairment or a disability theory, because it is, to use perhaps unfortunately visual metaphor, it shifts the frame, it shifts your gaze, it causes you to see things that you might not otherwise see, or perceive things or be aware of things you might not otherwise be aware of. And in some cases, it is also a hedge against what I'd call sanctioned ignorance. So sanctioned ignorance is basically the idea that not only as a scholar, you're constantly made aware of things you don't know, but there are certain things that we don't know or that we don't think about that are actually a product of institutions not wanting us to know or not wanting us to think about them in certain ways. And there are many examples of this, but one I can give is when I went to the archives at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to go through the papers of Norbert Wiener. And I was looking for something very specific in Wiener's papers. He was a famous mathematician. More can be said, but let's not. But what struck me is how present disability and impairment were in the papers, and this actually goes to Mara's point about, you know, the sort of status of disability in the history of science and technology. So Wiener's papers are filled with letters from people asking about prosthetics, asking about disability, and even in his own discussion of his life, his wife's life, depression comes up, all these different things. And yet, if you read the scholarship on Wiener, on cybernetics, on the history of systems, there's really very, very little on disability and Wiener until we get to Mara's essay on Wiener and Helen Keller and the hearing glove. And it was so striking to me as someone coming to this archival material after all of that, how much work actually had to be expended to not pay attention to disability in that material in order to write the other histories that had preceded Mara's. And so I, you know, instruction manuals for things often, you know, if you buy a Cuisinart, the instruction manual comes with like some recipes. And actually this instruction manual was the visual design was most influenced by the manual for a synthesizer made by Don Buchla, a musical instrument, which comes with suggestions for using it, for setting it up, for making music. And so I really designed it as a sort of set of exercises or like ways to cultivate your thinking and practice as a scholar to do creative things, ideally things that I wouldn't have thought of. And so that's my answer. So as long as we're talking about practice, let's talk a bit about the speed of practice and maybe get a bit into the book that we've been, I should say, slowly working on together. And one term that's been very important in disability theory and disability practice is this idea of crypt time. In fact, there was a special issue of the journal South Atlantic Quarterly that came out last year. I've taught a couple essays in it. They're really spectacular, and I recommend it to all of you. Again, the journal is South Atlantic Quarterly. But of course, Mara, you and I have talked a lot about crypt time. Usually when people talk about crypt time, they say, oh, crypt time is, you know, it's about being slow, which, you know, that's good. Slowness is a mode from which it is, or a vantage point from which it is very easy to critique both ableism and capitalism. But we've talked about how crypt time isn't always slow, and in fact, it may not even always be time. And I know you have a lot of ambivalence about this term. So maybe you want to say some things about how we can think about time and disability differently.
Oh yeah, I mean, and my thinking has even changed since we published this article that I have linked on this slide in 2020. We've been publishing articles like maybe one a year from this book, and we're actually going to give a talk from another episode of the book in a couple of weeks at the Sonorities Festival in Belfast. It'll be on Zoom. If people want my slides or references, I saw that in the comment. I dropped my email address in the Q&A, and I'm happy to send these to anyone who writes to me. And Jonathan and I can also, if you're interested in this current project, we can tell you about we can send you the info for the talk we're giving, so you can hear us talk together about it. But we wrote an article in 2020 for Triple Canopy on the history of time stretching, as Jonathan mentioned. This is a tool. It's now it was previously analog, now digital, totally ubiquitous, like in GarageBand and like every basic audio editing platform for changing the rate of sound without changing pitch, like speeding up a tape or something without having the chipmunk sound. And we show that it grew out of a combination of military work, especially World War II German engineering, avant-garde composition at the mid-century, and also blind oral speed reading. And yeah, we were having some trouble working with existing theories of crypt time that seemed to universalize the phenomenon as related to slowness, because we were writing, and also uncontrollability, because what we were writing about were blind readers who were actually highly controlling speed for the purpose of acceleration, and also for repetition and exploration sort of reading tasks. But I think we were even more exasperated with the vagueness of the word time. And we settled on the word rate instead. And the article we published was called Second Rate. So I'll just read what we ended up writing about rate. We said focusing on rate rather than time is instructive in interpreting accounts of early adopters. Here we're talking about blind people speed reading with tape recorders. Rate speaks to value as well as measure, quality, rank, and worth, as well as the speed of movement and pace of production. Rate is always contextual and relational. It always involves a per, as in words per minute. In relation to time, rate is a specification rather than an absolute. The quantitative rate is never isolated from the qualitative rate. Some rates are considered to be second rate. Now, since we published that article and a companion article in PMLA, a bunch of books have come out that offer new theories or other theories of crypt time. And I really enjoy seeing the elaboration of this concept, how it's just getting populated by all sorts of different kinds of ideas. The non-universal nature of disability and also crypt time is something that I strongly support. So I'll just flag two of these books that I really like. One is The Clearing by Jerome Ellis, spelled with 5 J's. I'm showing the plain blue book cover on this slide, as well as a page from the book. Actually, this page is a PDF taken from the article that preceded the book. But it shows how Ellis plays with typography to represent stuttering, but also to redesign the time of reading for the reader. So the font is in 2 different shades, and it includes repetitions and capitalizations. And Ellis argues in the book and in the article that stuttering and other disfluencies are ways to pause and expand time. Disfluencies are gifts of ellipsis, he writes. They open and shape time. They create alternative temporalities that can help us heal from the wounds of temporal subjection. And there's more to be said. These are citations just pointing to this universe of crypt time and theories of crypt time. The second recent theory of crypt time that I've been working with is from Lamar Jarrell Bruce's also 2021 book, How to Go Mad Without Losing Your Mind. This slide shows the cover of his book, which is an artwork of a Black person with French text painted in white lines across their face. And in this book, Bruce, among many other things, proposes a concept of mad time, which he says, and I'll read part of this quote, signifies various modes of doing time and feeling time coinciding with spasms and rhythms of madness. Mad time is multidirectional and polymorphous, deranged and dreamy, unruly and askew, capacious and kaleidoscopic. It tears calendars, smashes clocks, ignores calls for timeliness, builds makeshift time machines, writes poetry from the future, sings show tunes for the future, and dances to the lilt of voices in your head. It defies the Eurocentric heteronormative capitalist rationalist clock time that reigns in the modern West. Let's call this dominant chronology modern Western time, Western Standard Time, I mean. So I'll just say that, in addition to reading all these amazing secondary sources and theories coming about crypt time, as we've continued our research, Jonathan, and you don't know all of this yet, but you'll hear it in my part of our talk that we're giving in a couple of weeks. I've actually come across a ton of examples in the archive where oral reading among blind readers using tape recorders in the 70s and 80s in particular led to all sorts of other temporal interventions into sound. So where we left off with blind oral speed reading as a crypt time phenomenon is not the end story or the only story about what blind readers were doing, especially in the 70s and 80s with time and with tape recorders. Large numbers of blind people in the US were given free tape recorders from the NLS system of the Library of Congress in the 1970s. And these tape recorders had variable speed control and also time stretching capability, especially in the 80s. And many people using those tape recorders became experts in sound editing and playback. So in other words, reading led to the making of sound art and other kinds of sound design. And I don't have time to take you through the whole history from the 70s. I'll just mention 2 examples. One is this fantastic magazine, a tape magazine called Playback, produced by blind sound engineer Ed Potter of North Carolina, that ran from 1979 to 2007. It's almost the entire series is on archive.org. I don't know who preserved and digitized it, but I'm very grateful to that person. Playback was known as a cassette magazine, the main one that blind people turned to for technology news before the internet. And it's filled with tons of examples of Ed and other authors teaching subscribers to use tape recorders, not just to read and speed read and skim. They do that, but also to use their recorders in all these unexpected ways. I'm not going to play this clip because I want to end with a different one. If you want, I can send it to you, but you can also look at it on archive.org. This is an article titled "Weird Things You Can Do with Tape Recorders" from 1982, from one of the first generation time stretching machines. And he literally goes through and teaches subscribers to do things like basically to like recreate "I Am Sitting in a Room" by Alvin Lucier, which itself what we could say is a piece of disability sound art based on Lucier's stutter. It's pretty amazing. And when listening to this, I thought, oh, right. I had a limited set of interviews when I went in the previous articles we had done, and I had interviewed people who used tape recorders to speed read orally. But of course, lots of other people were doing other things besides read, and reading might be connected to something like art making in totally unexpected, or to me, unexpected ways. This is what the machines that I've been describing from the 70s and 80s looked like. Industrial, machines given for free by the Library of Congress. They have turned into devices recently that all sorts of sound artists, so this is an example of a sound artist at Heinbach from Germany, are now repurposing to make ambient sound. They've become like an incredibly trendy and hard to acquire tool. And it's not just sighted sound artists who are using these machines. I want to end with an example from Andy Slater of a blind sound artist today who is repurposing these historical machines from the 1970s and 80s, as well as historical talking books, not to read them, but to create new kinds of sound with them, to intervene into reading. This piece I'll just play like a couple seconds from is called "Dinner is Ruined Again." It's from his album Arcane Object. If you get the tape version of this, the cover is yellow and black, but it's amazingly tactile. It feels like gummy sandpaper. It's quite amazing. I'll just play the digital. It's from a set of cookbooks from the NLS Talking Book Library. And I think that rhymes in a way with what Jonathan has been talking about with handbooks.
One very large yellow onion.
In greased 8-by-8-inch cake pan, bake at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about 35 minutes.
Cut the potatoes lengthwise into quarters and then cut each quarter lengthwise into 3 wet.
Egg and vanilla, put sliced apples in mixture, 3/4 cup butter, 3 cups flour.
Served with a European-style pilsner such as...
I'll stop there since it's almost noon and just say, again, in terms of intervening into time, I've revised part of our thesis, which is just to say that blind oral speed reading helped usher in this tool, time stretching, into the world that so many people use. But that wasn't the only thing people were doing with these tape recorders. People were also making talking books unreadable, and they were using the spoken word as a sound effect. So let me stop share.
Okay, so we have some time for questions. I can manage things here. If you have questions for us, please type them into the Q&A. As panelists, we can't see the general chat, which is probably a great loss to us. But so please, if you have questions for us, type them in the Q&A section, and we will be happy to respond to them. There is a line from Miriam Fisher, says, unintended consequence of pandemic is awareness that virtual meetings and public forums were a venue for participation in previously unheard voices to articulate on issues that affect our lives and get change and accommodations. There's a current campaign in New York City to make hybrid public meetings permanent. Signed a petition during the break. Affects people with disabilities, childcare, transportation, health issues, many needs affected, and participation increased all over the country with virtual meetings and webinars such as today's meeting. That wasn't a question per se, but I would respond by saying yes. And I think that this is true with most accessibility technologies for communication. I don't think there's anything quite like, curb cuts that's quite as iconographic, maybe closed captioning or subtitling with access technologies for communication. But it is interesting and slightly what's the word I'm looking for? Distressing and disappointing to me, the amount of effort that, for instance, universities put into not providing hybrid or remote instruction this year with their efforts to bring us all back to the classroom and back to school. And the number of obstacles that were placed in people's way when the year before, at least at my university, the line was, we're all going to be online and let's be flexible and accommodating and things like that. So it really shows the degree to which not only that access is sort of institutionally given and taken away, but that the decisions about that are so completely arbitrary and often not involving people with disabilities. So movements like what Miriam's describing are super important. Because now it's been shown that this is possible, and I think it's important for us to act while these things are living memory and living experience. Other questions or comments?
I might ask a question since there aren't any right now, and I can't type into the Q&A, so I'll just ask.
Go for it, Bess.
Video. Hi, this is Bess. I'm so intrigued by the work that you all are doing on time. And obviously I think Ellen Samuels' work, Crip Time, and many of the others that you all noted has done so much to think about kind of the day-to-day practicalities, as well as a kind of phenomenology or like experiential components of being a disabled person in a society that is run on various standards. But I wondered if you could say a little bit more. I mean, your attention to it here, Mara, shows us how time is generative of like artworks and of like particular kinds of thinking. And I wonder if you could just say more about like, what are we missing when we're not looking at time in a variety of possible contexts?
Well, I can tell you as a historian what I missed by not thinking about time in the archive. There's a different answer for one's personal life and personal experience. And I should say, I do love that Ellen Samuels piece. We cited in that Triple Canopy article that we posted. When I started thinking about this project, strangely enough, Jonathan and I were working on separate tracks of this project, and it was Brian Kane at Yale, I think, who said, have you talked to Jonathan? You are both working on something like time stretching. And the weird thing is Jonathan and I talk all the time, but we just hadn't talked about this one project. But I had been digitizing the entire audio collection of both the AFB and the NFB with a grant that I got. So just a digital preservation project. And I listened to the amazing talking book collection that was part of the AFB archives. I believe, along with the Helen Keller archive, all of that material has now been transferred to the APH in Louisville. And as a sighted person who doesn't works with audiobooks sometimes, but it doesn't regularly listen to audiobooks and didn't listen to historical talking books or books on records, I just played the files. I just hit play on the file, either on the record or on the tape, or when they were digitized on the digital file, and let the machine dictate the standard speed. And I was really impressed by these records. They were produced by, in the 1930s at studios in New York with teams of Broadway stars, all these like important lesbian Broadway stars. I thought, oh, what a treasure to have like archived these fantastic examples of like sound effects from RCA and all these people coming together to produce artworks. And I later found out by working with my RA, Shafika Hashash, who's an NFBer and a blind activist, and her sending out an interview survey to the NFB list to anyone who was over a certain age and had used record players to listen to talking books, that no one really, the blind community by and large, didn't like these books and didn't listen to them the way they were supposed to be listened to, unless people who were late blinded, who were older, did. But many people wanted to speed read, skim, do all the things that readers do, the practices that are called, like in reading, in pedagogy, extensive reading, looking things up, going to an index, skimming, going back and forth. And it's really hard to do that with lots of sound effects and a dramatic narration. And people had, for years written letters in, which I hadn't seen yet, to the AFB and also to the NFB, demanding neutral narration and no sound effects at all. And eventually people started demanding tools to be able to speed up their machines. But I hadn't been thinking about time as a variable. I thought about time as fixed. It was the fixed speed of playback. But the blind people, historical from like the 30s, did see it as a variable. And we have all these examples of people hacking into their devices to make them play at different speeds. And we show in our article that this leads to these tools for time stretching that we all use now. But where our article leaves off, one would think that all blind people were doing was reading, and that, oh, it's avant-garde composers that were doing all this cool sound art. And in fact, I think we even have something in our article saying, why is it that composers are avant-garde and blind people are compensatory? I just hadn't found in the archive yet all these examples where actually there were lots of blind people were taking these tools and using them to make sound art at the same time. So yeah, not thinking about time meant that I misread materials in the archive. I didn't understand how to read them. And I was celebrating something that in terms of actors' categories or actors' experiences wasn't celebrated.
Thanks. Yeah, it's so striking, like sort of user tools, right? And yes, I guess it resonates for me also with my own experience of like visiting sites and trying to assess their accessibility, like in retrospect, and how little I can understand about that, about how people were sort of making their way or what tools they were used. What was the experience of, like, for example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's own ramps to his own house are not ADA accessible. And he was using a very different type of wheeled, like, dining room chair, basically, by sort of our current standards. And so, some of it is like the gulf of experience and research, I think is also what it kind of brings up, that I think is, a kind of universal in research, but comes up particularly in our fields. Anyway, I'll let you all continue. There's another comment in the Q&A.
Okay, this is from Anne Elizabeth. And Anne Elizabeth says, we see that it is not only possible, but better in many cases. I'm also fascinated by several things. What do you make of the amount of effort spent on making classes or materials or access to those things accessible? And there's a comma, so maybe it continues. Also, I'm impressed about the difficulties that arise when any method is presented that doesn't work for everyone. For example, how expensive it is to have live closed captioning as opposed to AI captions. Okay, I'll take a shot and then Mara can take a shot. So it says, what do you make of the amount of the effort spent not making classes or materials or access to those things accessible? I mean, I just think that that's how ableism works, right? Like any structure of inequality, whether we're talking about ableism, systemic racism, sexism, heterosexism, ageism, pick your structure of inequality, which isn't to say that they operate all the same, but one thing that they all have in common is the amount of effort required and energy required to maintain them. And the degree to which that they are based on various kinds of artificial distinctions that must be institutionally reinforced and upheld through things like sanctioned ignorance, or and I don't know if you've come up with a better word for this, Mara, but something you once called technology withdrawal, where a technology is made an access technology is made available and then later withdrawn when it's decided that it will be used for something else. And then there's also compliance culture. So for instance, online meetings, are a fairly normal thing now, but not all online meeting platforms, Zoom being one of them, are equally accessible or accessible to the same people or accessible in the same way. The AI captions, for instance, are quite variable. They also come with a price, which is the use of voice printing and the creation of data lakes by media corporations, where essentially for the provision of this quote unquote free service, they are creating data doubles of speakers and that information can then be used without our consent. I'd also say when we talk about expensive versus live versus cheap, what labor are our institutions willing to pay for, right? So signing and captioning by human beings is often understood as expensive or an add-on or something that's additional. That's seen as expensive, but the universities routinely spend, for instance, something like $50,000 on a headhunting firm to search for a new administrator, or even sometimes endowed professorships, when they could for free go and ask their faculty about it, right? So budget priorities themselves are political, and I'm sure the same is true in other institutions. And it's a question of what kinds of labor are understood as necessary for the institution to continue to exist, right? And that in turn relates to who is included and excluded in the institution's self-conception. And that's where disability intervenes, right? Through challenging these sort of logics of marginalization. So that's my first stab at a thought on that. Thank you for that question. Mara, you have anything to add?
I could just add briefly that from the design perspective, since that's the theme of our, the overall theme of our time together today, I really recommend the work of Cindy Bennett, who is a postdoc in HCI, human-computer interaction at Carnegie Mellon, and who's co-authored and authored a ton of articles around rethinking the user tester role in the engineering and design process. And, first off, arguing that disabled people need to be included in that process, but also not simply as user testers, especially not just as one-off testers, but as engineers and designers, and if not that, then as like longer-term collaborators, to make sure that to avoid some of the pitfalls of inaccessible design. But of course, technology does not act on its own. And once a technology, even a technology that seems to be accessible, is out in the world, there's just so many other factors that influence its adoption and use, from training to cost. To it being welcoming, to it being like culturally appropriate or not not biased. So there's like a whole, design is like one step, and there's great work being done by people like Cindy on that, but then there's a whole set of other things that can end up thwarting even the best designed product.
Okay, we are at time, so I'm going to say thanks, Mara, for yet another great public conversation. Always lovely to do stuff with you. I want to say congratulations again to Bess, and thank you so much for including us in this. It was a real pleasure. I want to thank the people doing captioning and signing also for all of their labor. It is much appreciated and much noticed. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine. Zoom wave.
Thank you so much. I want to just express my appreciation for these superb presentations and conversations. Thank you, Bess, Amy, Jonathan, and Mara. And I also really appreciate our audience for participating in the way that you have with the Q&A and other questions, and please continue to do so as we progress to the rest of the symposium this afternoon. We're going to break for lunch, and we will reconvene at 1:30. Thank you. Thank you so much, first of all, Bess and Amy and Jonathan and Mara, for a really wonderful and thought-provoking session this morning. And we are looking forward to the afternoon session. And just to say that I am a white woman with shoulder length brown hair, wearing a black shirt with a red scarf. And again, on behalf of Bard Graduate Center, we're very grateful to all our participants and to you, the audience. And please feel free to, put your questions into our question and answer function. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Again, I'm Bess Williamson, author of Accessible America, and it's been my pleasure to have a number of folks here speaking with me. And for this afternoon, I have 3 artists and designers whose work has been really informative to me, but I think maybe more than anything kind of takes us out of history, or sort of get from our connection to history to the present and our creative worlds. A couple of like housekeeping things. So first of all, we have cart captioning today. It is accessible using the CC button on your Zoom screen, or using the stream text link if you prefer to see it in a separate window, and the link to that is in the chat. However, the chat overall is not usable during this webinar, and instead we ask you to post questions in the Q&A, the window, which will be visible to all, and we can answer together as they come up. For our conversation this afternoon, I'm going to invite each of these 3 artists individually into the spotlight, so to speak. Riva Lehrer, Jen White-Johnson, and Josh Halstead. And I'll introduce each one as I bring them in. Each will speak for about 15 minutes about their work, and then we'll switch to the next person, and then we'll have time for questions and afterwards. So please do use the Q&A. We will have plenty of time for questions and commentary afterwards. So without further ado, I'll introduce Riva. Riva Lehrer is an artist, writer, and curator who focuses on the socially challenged body. She's best known for representations of people whose physical embodiment, sexuality, or gender identity have long been stigmatized. Riva's work has been seen in venues including the National Portrait Gallery of the Smithsonian, Yale University, the United Nations, the National Museum of Women in the Arts, the Arnott Museum, the De Cordova Museum, the Frye Museum, the Chicago Cultural Center, and the State of Illinois Museum. And her awards are many. I'm not going to list them all, but there are many, including 3 Arts McDowell Fellowship for Writing, the 3 Arts Residency Fellowship at the University of Illinois, the latter, which is quite important in our disability worlds, as well as many grants, including those from the Illinois Arts Council, the University of Illinois, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Riva's memoir, Gollum Girl, was published by the One World imprint of Penguin Random House in 2020, and I that just can't say enough to recommend its many connections, particularly its insights, I guess, sort of locally for me, into the disability culture and art world of Chicago in recent decades. In 2021, it was awarded the inaugural Barbellion Prize for Disabled Voices in Writing, and was nominated for a National Book Critics Circle Award for Autobiography. Ms. Lehrer is on faculty at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, my home institution, and an instructor in the Medical Humanities Department of Northwestern University. Riva, thank you for joining me here, and I'll pass that to you.
Thank you so much, Beth, and it's so cool being with everybody here. I am going to start with a PowerPoint. I'm sure you're all just so excited about another PowerPoint. But Bess was particularly interested in my history. Okay, so my work is completely about disability, community and culture, and collaboration. And yet I spent many decades absolutely hating being disabled. The interesting thing is that from kindergarten until 8th grade, I was a student at something called the Randall J. Condon School for Disabled Children, handicapped, originally crippled children, then handicapped children. We didn't make it to disabled before the school was knocked down. But what that did is that all of my fellow students, all of them were disabled with a whole range of disabilities. And I didn't realize until years later that that gave me a grounding in what it was like to be able to stop feeling stigmatized for a few hours a day, to just be a person and not the local gawking site, entertainment freak. I use that word, of course, with ironclad air quotes. So I want to show you some pictures of that school. I am, however, going to start off with a little bit of a couple other images. Oh, I should describe myself. My apologies. I am a short white woman in her 60s with red and white striped hair. The red part is chosen, shall we say. I'm wearing a striped shirt with a white collar, and if I stood up and walked around, you would see that I am very short and that I have very large orthopedic boots and walk with an extremely obvious limp. So on the left is the cover of my book, Golem Girl. I'm standing there with my arms around myself in a red sweater, but my face is obscured by an X-ray. On the right, though, is a picture of me in first grade at Condon School. I have black hair. I'm painting a painting of a doggy, and I put this in because right from the beginning, the art room and being an artist was a way of gaining an identity that wasn't about being the poor little crippled girl that everyone treated me as. The next slide is something entirely different because we're talking about accessibility. This is a picture of my studio at home. We're actually sitting in my studio. So I split my studio into a couple months ago. This, where I am right now, is my painting studio, where I'm working on a large portrait of Rosemary Garland Thompson, whom many of you will be familiar with. But here at home is my drawing studio. They're almost identical. And I wanted to show this because that is a mechanical crank easel, because I can't lift and lower my work. There's a footrest. There's an adjustable chair with a lot of pillows on it. But what I think is most interesting is the setup I have in front of the easel, where there's a long board anchored on either end by rolling pieces of furniture, surrounded by rolling pieces of furniture, because I can't stand up for very long to paint, nor can I lean forward very much. So I had to come up with a way to have my easel and all of my equipment right in front of me to allow me to work for long periods of time, identical to where I'm sitting now, but you know, we're all coming up with ways of making our work. Okay. Oh, and just to familiarize people, I am a portraitist. I make portraits of people who deal with stigma in order to understand embodiment and to collaborate on what it means to be seen in the bodies we have. This is a drawing of Achille Bejas, the queer Cuban poet novelist. She's asleep. There are texts coming down from near her ear because she's becoming deaf. It's a very complex piece. There's a vitrine in front of it with another scene inside. All of the texts are about her sex life, her erotic life, and the piece deals with that. This is going to be in the National Portrait Gallery Triennial next month. This is portrait of Alice Shepherd. It's a very large Mylar drawing. Alice is nude, laying sideways on her, oh, I should say, Achille Bejas is a white presenting, but I believe she identifies as a woman of color, forgive me. Woman with very dark hair, asleep on a couch. Alice is a Black British woman who is seen here nude, horizontal, laying on top of a drawing, sort of a schematic of her wheelchair, in a very gestural pose surrounded by theater curtains. There's a lot to say about this piece, but I'll just say it's part of a particular project that had to do with my ongoing search to equalize the risk on either side of the easel, that the risk for the artist is as intense as the risk for the subject. And so these pieces are highly collaborative. And finally, one of my self-portraits called 66 Degrees from a few years ago when I was dealing with changes in my body. This is a largish acrylic painting in which you see me nude from the back. I'm standing in sort of a green pond. There's a gold evening gown falling off my shoulders, and there's streams of water sort of bracketing me and caging me, holding me down, different ways of looking at it. Okay, so now to Condon School, and that's Condon. Condon School opened, I believe, in 1923, had been begun to be constructed in around 1919. The history is fascinating. It was, the progressive thing about Condon is that at the time, children like me, well, first off, kids like me were institutionalized even when I was born. It's very complex why I didn't grow up in an institution. But there was a movement not to send kids to institutions in Cincinnati, but to give them standard educations, which, as I think most of us know, institutional life does not. Most of that, especially at the time when Condon was constructed, was if you got any education at all, it was for sweatshop training. So minimal math, minimal literacy, you didn't leave the institution. So the groundbreaking thing about Condon is it was not residential, and it was based on trying to give disabled children the same education as the elementary school kids in the Cincinnati area. So on the lower left of this image, these are all vintage pictures taken from yearbooks. These were not my yearbooks. My grandmother decided to throw mine out. That's a whole other story. But I had a compatriot slightly younger than me who still retained his yearbook. So these are pictures from there. So there's a picture of our high school, our school principal, Mr. Hofter, who I was terrified of, who's actually a very sweet man. And then a picture of Condon itself. And this is a color picture now. It's the only one not from the yearbook. And here we see a very unusual building with a kind of a stucco exterior that is festooned with all of these very elaborate friezes and ceramics and ornamentations. The point being that they really saw Condon as a gorgeous place that should be aesthetically rewarding for the children inside, and it was. Here is, so this is the exterior. The ceramics are all kind of dun or beige color with some blue detailing, but here are a few details of the ceramics and murals inside the building. Actually, upper left, here's a detail of the cornice line, which always cracks me up, these cherubs with scissors. We say, well, running with scissors isn't okay, but flying with them apparently is. Some lower, these were done, everything we're seeing here, the flag ceramic, these are bas-reliefs. The woman with the book, or child with the book, I believe, woman. And this one that another sort of elaborate image of a book with lots of ornamentation around it. And then to the all the way to the right, this was a drinking fountain inside Condon School that depicts the Pied Piper. And it's in full color. And all of these were done for you design students by the very famous Rookwood pottery, which was one of the most famous arts and crafts potteries in America at the time. And it'll give you an idea of the feeling they wanted to engender at Condon. Next slide is just a quick snapshot that I managed to maintain of my first year, second grade rather, at Condon. And you can see that the students, the proportion of Condon was roughly 60% white, 60, 70 something percent white, and 30 to 40% Black, which is extremely unusual for the time. Cincinnati schools were highly segregated. So at Condon, having a disability sort of trumped your other identities. So this shows children in wheelchairs, children using crutches, children with large protective helmets that they used at the time for children with hydrocephalus. And like I said, a number of, or a mix of both Black and white students. I am lower left, wearing a little pink dress, kneeling. Okay, here's some vintage pictures. The thing to know about Condon is that it was also considered to be the breakthrough accessible architectural approach anywhere in the country at the time. It was quite celebrated. So there was a lot done to make the building accessible in their terms at the time in 1920, whatever, and then adapted as it went on. We would laugh our asses off, but at the time, this was quite groundbreaking. So we see that a lot of the furniture is very low, that there's some climbing frames, but there are climbing areas for children who would be wheelchair users who could sort of hoist themselves up. Everything is kind of set so that if you are a wheelchair user, you can reach just about everything. There are no kids in this picture, but it gives you also a sense of the kind of arts and crafts-ish aesthetic, almost stickly feeling of the woodwork. But the thing about Condon too, what is I keep saying this thing? There's so many things. Is it was also very, very medical. So while on one hand the classrooms were made to be their concept of accessible, it was also space that hosted quite a bit of medical attention. So here on the left we see the sick bay, which were a whole range of tables or beds rather that were raised up. Not so much, I mean, this for kids to lay down on if they were ill, but they were raised so that they could be examined. And all of these spaces doubled both as care spaces and as spaces where doctors would come from various hospitals around the country, not just Cincinnati, to study us. So for instance, I was in a number of longitudinal studies about spina bifida. So on the left, we see the sick bay. On the upper right, we see a nurse taking a temperature of a young white blonde girl in a wheelchair. On lower right, we see the dental bay. One of the missions was to give free dental care to the children who were often recognized as coming from families with very little income. So there's a Black dentist. I love this picture. There's a Black dentist giving care to what looks like a Black student in a very elaborate dental office. Here is a picture of a boy with a kind of very 1950s rockabilly hair, having a doctor using a stethoscope on his chest while a nurse looks on. So that's in the doctor's office proper. And then we had physical therapy. We had physical therapy every day. Every day that I was at Condon, from kindergarten to 8th grade, I went to physical therapy right after lunch. And so we see a little bit of the suite with a medicine ball, with mats on the floor, with physical therapists working with children. There's a picture of an older white woman with sort of these Black glasses, working with a little girl on some kind of balance device. Here's just a look at a classroom. I almost didn't put this in, but I really liked the dispersal. You know, it's just all these kids together in a classroom that looks like any other classroom. It doesn't look medical. It's just a lot of kids all learning their lessons at once. And at best, that's what it was like there. This is something that fascinates Bess, which maybe we'll talk about later, which is the home ec program. There's a lot to say about that, but basically in home ec, we were being taught to take care of ourselves. Home ec at the time in the general schools was meant to teach you, if you were female, to be a wife and mother. We were not being trained that. We were being trained to make our own meals if nobody was there to take care of us. So my book has a lot of stories about the implications and the day that changed. But again, there's our home ec teacher, Mrs. Copeland, who is also Black, with this sort of beautiful suit dress on and really sort of stylish hair. And there's a young Black boy with an afro doing some kind of, I'm not quite sure what he's making, but around the table are kids in wheelchairs and kids who are not. Here's an assembly, which gives you a little bit of an idea of the size of Condon. There were generally around 220 students from kindergarten all the way through 8th grade. So it gives you a size of the school. Here's one of our school plays. And the reason I put this in is that at Condon, one of the profound things was that we were all disabled. So if we were going to have the school play, all the kids were disabled. If you were going to have Christmas pageant or whatever, we didn't have to ask permission. We didn't have to pray that we'd be cast. Everything, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, Glee Club, everything, it was all disabled kids. And I wonder how many of us out here have ever had an experience like that. Come on, honey. Next slide, please. And I think that might be it. So that gives you an idea. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
Thanks so much, Riva. We'll bring you back, but thank you for that introduction. Thanks so much for bringing in your work as well. So Jen, I'm going to ask you to come. You should come on in if you unmute yourself and unmute your camera. Thank you. Thanks so much, Jen. I'm delighted to introduce you here as our next panelist. I'm going to read here from your bio. Jen White Johnson is an Afro-Latina disabled artist, designer, educator, and activist whose visual work explores the intersection of content and caregiving with an emphasis on redesigning ableist visual culture. As an artist educator with Graves' disease and ADHD, her heart-centered and electric approach to disability advocacy bolsters these movements with invaluable currencies. Powerful, dynamic art and media that all at once educates, bridges divergent worlds, and builds a future that mirrors her autistic son's experience. When her son was diagnosed as autistic at age 2, she began to examine the absence of Black disabled children in digital and literary media. And this motivated the release of an advocacy photozine entitled Knox Rocks, dedicated to her autistic son. And I'll just say on the side, you can find Jen's work on her website, jenwhitejohnson.com, with including these zines, several zines, stickers, posters, and other work. Jen's Jen's activist and advocacy work has been featured in the Washington Post, Afropunk, the New York Times, Teen Vogue, Latina.com, and is permanently archived in libraries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the National Museum of Women in the Arts. Jen is currently a guest lecturer of design justice at the University of Minnesota School of Design. She holds an MFA in graphic design from the Maryland Institute College of Art and a BA in visual arts from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So thank you, Jen, for joining us, and I'll disappear for a moment here and let you speak.
This is an honor and a joy to hold space with everyone today. Thank you for the little delay. I was, getting myself together. But a quick image description of myself. I have caramel cinnamon skin. I'm an Afro-Latina woman, and I'm wearing a gold headband and a shirt that says "The future is accessible." And I'm in my studio space with posters that say "Create and Resist" and "Vote 2020." And there's a Robin poster in the back, and also symbols and iconography that represent disability justice. And I'm joining you from Baltimore, Maryland this afternoon. And I have a gap in my teeth. And I'm just super excited to just join everyone today. Thank you, Riva, Josh, Bess, everyone who's been so beautiful to witness and to just gather with today in collective joy and crip joy and disability love. And so I'm gonna just share a little bit of what my work and what I do as as a mother who does identify as disabled with an autoimmune disorder and also ADHD, all in the name of love and accessibility. So it's truly a joy to kind of hold space today with Bess and everyone to kind of talk a little bit about what accessibility means to me, especially from the lens of a Black person whose narratives oftentimes get erased, and we often live under, the heavy stigmas of disability and how we should be ashamed of who we are, and how, if at any point in time we choose to celebrate our disabilities, that's something that is not allowed. It's something that shouldn't necessarily be, disability. No, like, you should be ashamed. You shouldn't hold space for the joy and the celebratory nature of your work. And as an artist and as a visual maker, a visual artist, I knew that I really had to spend my disability journey really uplifting the Black and Brown community through my favorite things, which are design and photography. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to show you some of the stuff that informs my work. And I'm hoping that you enjoy it, and that you see how it really intersects with the definition of visual culture as liberatory practice, crip joy as a celebratory practice, and that accessibility really we can't really engage with that conversation without holding space for those really in-depth narratives from Black and Brown people. So I'm gonna share my screen. All right, so I have a few slides here, and I'm gonna try to get through them quickly. And I'm going to be providing image descriptions. So because of my ADHD, I do tend to be hyperverbal. So my apologies if I am speaking quickly at any time. Bess, you can, if anyone is saying in the chatter at some point that I'm speaking too fast, I can slow down. So content warning. Some of the images that I'm going to show do talk a little bit about anxiety, suicide, racism, ableism, but then there's also a lot of joy as well. So thank you for holding space for some of the artwork that I'm going to show. I'm going to, here we go. So similar to what Reva showed, I'm so glad that I was able to see the little girl in disability joy, crip joy. I often like to incorporate, this is who I was in 1988 when I was 8 years old in Silver Spring, Maryland. And I was undiagnosed at this time with having ADHD. And on the right-hand side, you see a photograph of me from the 3% conference just this past November. And I was 40 years old in 2021. And it's so cool to kind of compare these two worlds, the little Black girl, little Black Puerto Rican girl, kind of like doing that same little hand pose and really eccentric and expressing herself in so much joy. And as a kid, I was given a lot of agency to kind of be free and to be me. It wasn't until I grew up and I started really understanding how inaccessible the world was that I started feeling like I needed to change and I needed to adapt and I needed to kind of mask those things about myself that I thought were so special and unique, in having ADHD. And so something that really kind of, anchors who I am is also motherhood. I do have a Black 9-year-old autistic son who means the world to me and who really just allowed for me to be very open and vulnerable about my own disabilities. And he was born in 2012 at 2 pounds, 15 ounces. And it was a really scary time, and this is a photograph of us in the NICU. I meant to put 2012, but I put 2021 there by accident. But this is in 2012 because he's 9 years old now. But if you need to be reminded, preeclampsia, which is what had him come early. I was only 31 weeks. It's the leading cause of maternal death among Black women. And I was one of the blessed ones who is still here. Like, I'm not even really supposed to be here right now giving you this talk. Black women are 5 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related cardiomyopathy, blood pressure disorders than white women. And not enough support and advocacy is being done for the Black and Brown, and Latina communities when it comes to Black maternal health. So a lot of us have to share resources. A lot of us have to really infuse that collective care within our own pathways to make sure that we have access. Black disabled women and girls experience economic insecurity at higher rates, which means that we often have to try harder to graduate from college, graduate with master's degrees and PhDs, just so that we're not seen as less than, often we're victims of job loss, sub-minimum wages, as low as 2.13 per hour for disabled workers, and reduced earnings caused by barriers to education and skills and development and other challenges. As I said, as a Black disabled woman, and this statistics comes from a recent article that everyone should read from the Center for American Progress, an article that talked about the inequities in living and existing in this economic space right now, being a Black and Brown disabled woman. We have to work just as hard, even harder, to be accepted and to produce our own work and to get published. So it's not easy being a Black and disabled woman in America. Some of the articles that really inform my work are articles like this from the Harvard Business Review, Why People Hide Their Disabilities at Work. Here's a statistic on the right-hand side that from the Washington Post, just last year, fatal police shootings of people showing signs of mental illness. And here we can see that the stats go up when we're looking at Black and Brown disabled bodies. And this is in combination with so many folks that we've seen: Sandra Bland, Freddie Gray, Elijah McClain, Walter Wallace Jr., George Floyd, so many folks who, are not given the adequate care that they are due. And my work is informed by Fannie Lou Hamer, who is my revolutionary godmom in terms of, suffering from medical abuse and forced sterilization as a Black woman, but also very active in the suffrage movement and worked for the right to vote. And this entire time, when she's advocating for folks in the community, she was beaten in jail. She, was dealing with PTSD, kidney damage, dealing with different disabilities that oftentimes she really didn't have a lot of room to get the proper care for, because she saw so much of the inequities that were happening to Black and Brown folks who were just trying to get equal access to vote for the policies in their neighborhoods. And just last year, Isabel Trishanor, age 10, this story hit me really hard because she was an autistic Black girl living in Utah, who died by suicide just because she was bullied by students, including her teacher, just for being Black and autistic. And then, statistics like this: more than half of disabled Black people in the United States will be arrested by the time they reach their late 20s. 33 to 50% of police use, police sanctioned state violence involves a disabled person. And so being Black and disabled in America, trying to be an artist, trying to be creative, all of this informs what I do. And it ensures that I have to keep doing what I'm doing as a parent, as a Black disabled parent, a Black disabled artist and designer and educator, to make sure that I'm building a world that is equitable for this kid right here. So this is my autistic son that I showed you earlier, who was born 2 pounds, 15 ounces. This was him in 2014 when he turned 2 years old. And this was when he was diagnosed as autistic. And instantly, you know, we were foddered so much information on how we have to fix him, how we have to make sure that he appears quote unquote normal in society. And that's the only way that he's going to be accepted, especially as a Black autistic kid. And I was like, I don't want for him to exist in this very medical model of disability. Like, where are all my social activists that are uplifting Black and brown kids who are disabled? You know, Black Lives Matter. That conversation shouldn't necessarily be, it can't be a full and equitable conversation if we're not talking about all Black lives. And so there was a lot of fear mongering, you know, and I knew that fear is the enemy, hope is everything, acceptance is how it happens. And this is a really amazing quote by Lynn Soraya. And so I was like, okay, so where does that leave me? I'm an educator, I'm doing so many things with my students, and I'm trying to kind of live this life of disability. When my son was diagnosed as autistic, I wasn't even fully identifying as someone living with ADHD. I was very, like, even in grad school, I didn't talk about my own, you know, neurodiversity at all. I wasn't really amplifying like that conversation just within my own path. And this is a lot of the reason why, because, you know, in 2019, the statistic, you know, as we can see, according to diverse books, there isn't a lot of literature that amplifies or even celebrates disabled folks. I mean, let alone Black and brown kids have, you know, authors have had to take on, you know, the agency of change hat to really propel these narratives for ourselves, because it's very dominated by 41.8% white folks, you know. And then when you look at the statistics on the right, as you can see, 3.4% of all books. And then, you know, queer narratives are 3.1, you know. And so it's not that there's not disabled and queer artists that are refusing to tell their stories. They are, but they often don't get the visibility. They don't get publishing deals. They don't have agents. They don't have folks that are ready to just drop funds in you know, in their bank accounts to say, hey, we want to give you, like, you know, the agency to be able to kind of be in control of your own narrative. And so that 3.4% of disabled faces and bodies that are infused in books, I knew that I wanted to contribute to that, to somehow lifting like that narrative, even if it meant that I had to self-publish, that I had to continue to create my own media just in my living room, which is what I started to do, because I didn't really want to get caught up in this narrative of my kid is autistic, which means that I need to instantly repair him. You know, he's not a machine, he's not a robot, he's a human. He is a person with a living, beating heart. And it's my job and it's the community's job to ensure his safety. So what you see here are, he's growing, he's thriving. What you see are Black and white photographs of him in autistic glee. And we would just play around with posing and showcasing his happiness and his joy. And what you can see here, what you see here written on his shirts are, you know, little mini manifestos that we would share with our neurodivergent community. So advocate for your autistic self, advocate acceptance. And in 2018, I had already been documenting my son's autistic journey just for my own family and to help kind of destigmatize like what everyone in my family was thinking that they can kind of solve or assist or help. And I was like, well, I really want to continue to understand neurodivergency like through my own lens and through my son's own lens. And so I decided to, with my friends at Homie House Press, to publish this zine that was essentially a love letter to Brown and Black autistic families. And so there's a manifesto here that opens up the book and it says, welcome to Knoxverse, where every family's experience is different, but the commonality is that our children are not burdens and they did not ask for any of the challenges they face. And they depend on those who love them to equip them to be successful and to reinforce the fact that they are incredibly special and don't need to be fixed. And so that zine opened up so many opportunities for me to continue having beautiful dialogue with, non neurodiverse, communities. And then just being able to say, hey, like, here's my kid in leg braces. And this is how, he was happy at just being, his beautiful disabled self. And let's uplift that. Let's, not create this really sad, charity model that all of these kids are so broken from the inside and they don't experience the love, within their own communities and within their own families. And so I just started to play around with, like, what does accessible, joyful design, uplifting disability, like, what does that look like? Because I just really didn't see a lot of it. It's like, if you weren't in the disability community, you really weren't privileged to seeing a lot of this imagery because of what the media is constantly feeding us. And so I started playing around with language, the soul of neurodiversity. Like, I started pairing up language. I started having fun with celebratory messages, language justice-based graphics to basically fix and to basically address, like, what I wasn't seeing. And essentially that's what disabled oracles, that's what we do. Like, this is essentially crypt wisdom, and a lot of it is very much rooted inside. It's like something that we've always had, but we didn't know that we had it. And I began to tap into it, and I began to realize it's really up to us to be able to start spreading this message of autistic joy. Hashtags like My Disabled Life is Worthy, created by Crutches and Spice, my homegirl Amani Barberin, and then deciding to come up with statements like create more anti-ableist spaces, very clear, direct language, infused in very simplified illustrations to be able to have, and all of this work was created in creative protest, encouraging people to download these graphics, share them at protests. So one symbol that I created 2 years ago, right at the precipice of this pandemic, was the Black Disabled Lives Matter symbol. I added the Black Disabled Lives Matter like text later, but the fist that you see here, kind of coexisting with the neurodiversity infinity symbol, was something that I hadn't really seen before. It's like social justice intersecting into this narrative of cognitive, resistance and cognitive disability, like celebratory practices. Like it's always important that as educators, crypt study enthusiasts and theorists, that we begin to play a lot with iconography, seeing what that theory and that pedagogy can continue to visually produce. And then what you see here is a sticker design that says Black Autistic Lives Matter, because the pandemic really showed us a lot of inequities that the disability community was facing. And we were all caught up in it. The revolution will not be televised. We were in it. We were living in it. That revolution was existing all around us, in our own communities. We were seeing people arrested. We were seeing people imprisoned. And we were always seeing Black people, these inequitable statistics, like these numbers that clearly showed that there was a social and violent disparity and a war against Black and brown disabled bodies. And so I began to have conversations with my white neurodiverse friends, my Black neurodiverse friends. And I was like, what is it that we're really trying to say here? And, to be pro neurodiversity is to be anti-racist, because we saw, as I had mentioned, that there were so many inequities, and this conversation of the intersection of race and disability, it was only happening in very small circles. And if you weren't paying attention, as most able-bodied folks don't, they weren't really listening and understanding or holding space for what the Black and brown community, disability community, what we were saying. And so the symbol, I shared it online for free. People were downloading it, using it in protests. I had friends say, hey, please get this t-shirt made. So my favorite thing was having the t-shirt available on the website so folks could like donate some money and wear the shirts. And what you see here is one of my Black friends, his son who is epileptic. He had just come from an appointment. You can see the little, you can see the bandage on his arm where he got blood work done. He had just come from an appointment, and he wore that Black Disabled Lives Matter t-shirt in solidarity to the doctor's office. In the center, you see a white disabled woman, Liz Jackson. I'm sure many of you are familiar with their work. She was, rocking the t-shirt, and it was so beautiful to just kind of see her, to see the celebratory like glow on Liz's face was just mind-blowing. And then on the right-hand side, you see Winter, who is a really good disabled friend of mine who lives with Down syndrome all the way in California, rocking her Black Disabled Lives Matter tee. And then Carrie Gray, a lot of other disabled advocates in the community that are, uplifting disability leadership and voices that we need to be paying attention to. And that, there are a lot of Black and Brown disabled leaders that, again, are doing the work. They're on the ground, they're at festivals, they're at the White House, they are embodying all these really beautiful conversations and exchanging in dialogue with policymakers and corporations that, we are Black, we are disabled, and we are empowered. I had the privilege, so with all of this visual work, I was very afraid to like begin writing. Even as a design educator, I was afraid to write about all of this. And even the photo zine focused more on poetry, very kind of like letters of reflection and essays. But I was so excited that folks were paying attention, especially in the Black and Brown communities, where I just really didn't feel like I was getting, honestly, like a lot of support because of the stigma that is so entrenched in the Black and Brown community, especially if you're living with a disability. No one is celebrating that. No one really wants to talk about that identity, that expression, and that reflection. And I was so happy that my really good friends, Ann Barry, Jennifer Rittner, Kelly Walters, Leslie Ann Noel, Kareem Kali, they reached out and said, hey, we're putting this book together called The Black Experience in Design, and we want for you to submit an essay that just encapsulates like, what you've been doing, your activism, your advocacy, your community engaged design work, even outside of what you're doing as a professor. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna give it to y'all. I'm not gonna give you this kind of charity model of this how to raise an autistic kid or how to be a Black and disabled person, and here's the research and the help that you need to get better. It's like, no, this is how we exist and this is how we live. So from the Black Anti-Ableist Diary, a tribute to my Black disabled son from a Black disabled mother, it was just a joy to continue to just write and to just kind of share like this honest, true disabled narrative. And specifically like, how we use zine making and writing to create essentially like our own kid crypt, like critical studies. Like this is what we do at home. And it's important that this conversation of crypt joy, crypt studies, disability studies doesn't start when you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s, like it did with many of us. A lot of us, like Riva and Josh and all, like we've been living this world like our entire lives, and now people are focused on what we're doing as artists and as designers and the story that we have to tell. And my work is very much rooted in, okay, well, I'm older, I'm a mother. How am I teaching my son? How am I bringing him into this conversation? And how is he kind of learning about disability culture and celebrating it on his own terms when he gets to author the actual like stories himself? And so we'll write zines together that talk about autistic joy. And it was really amazing because the zine was able to be featured in the Black Experience in Design. And we were able to have a really fun photo of that book. And I was able to talk a little bit about how we use writing and poetry and storytelling to kind of, tell our own disability, our own crypt joy narrative. like kid crib studies is like my passion right now. I teach at the University of Minnesota where my students are creating a lot of work, but this is kind of like my main priority to kind of keep developing really beautiful, sustainable pathways for families to kind of create these resources for their own kids. And we share a lot of these resources. We have a lot of fun at home. And we, you know, as you can see here, this was all throughout the pandemic. We shared a lot of these virtual resources where folks could download and print and paste them in their windows, these statements, to have these conversations with their kids, especially with their white children. Knox got a chance to have his first zine pack at the Print Matters virtual art book fair last year. And so we're serious, like we're, you know, like kid crib studies is like our thing right now that we're kind of dissecting and that we're holding space for. And you know, we've again, we share zines with his administrators, with his principals, with the school counselors that kind of talk a little bit about like his challenges and the things that he needs accommodations for. And these are just some slides that kind of showcase that some of the needs that, you know, that aren't special, that should be honored regardless if you were disabled or not. We've had friends adapt like some of the zines that we've made for their own families, and this is like really beautiful. This was this kid in North Carolina named Quest that used the design and was able to adapt the zine for his own, you know, Just Keep Stimming. And it was just so cool to be able to share these resources and to make sure that the work that I'm creating is creating accessible pathways for other families. So yeah, and this is just, you know, again, I'm teaching at the University of Minnesota, disability, racism, and the intersections of design justice. And so, you know, the work that I'm doing in the community with kids is also filtering into the classroom as well. So yeah, these are just some of the slides from the work that my students are working on right now, which I'm so excited to just kind of give you a quick preview of. So, all right, that's it. Thank y'all so much.
Jen, this is fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jen. And I was thinking about another time that I got to speak with Jen. We were like talking to like college students, and the chat was so full of like, "Oh, this is so exciting!" And we don't have that here because we're in that webinar format. So one thing I just wanted to invite the audience to feel free to share thoughts in the Q&A. They don't have to be questions; they can also be comments and responses to what we're seeing, because I think there's just a lot to say here, and it's so great to see some threads in common also with Riva's talk. So we'll be back. We'll have you back in a moment, but I'm gonna go ahead and introduce Josh as well. So Josh, you can unmute yourself and uncamera mute yourself, and you'll show up next to me in just a second here. There you are. Hi. I'm happy also to introduce Josh. I was thinking, I don't know, a number of people have mentioned already, like we have talked together before, but I realize it's been a while. So we've presented at a few conferences together, but I was thinking we were like way ahead of the curve. One time I remember that we were speaking at SDS, and you were like on a little screen in our conference session. Anyway, I'm not going to go down that path, but I'm happy to introduce you. So Joshua A. Halstead, who uses pronouns he, they, is an epistemic activist working at the intersection of critical disability studies, design pedagogy, and community organizing. A recognized contributor to disability design discourse, they seek to unsettle and rupture normative systems of thought by centering marginalized perspectives. Halstead has been an invited lecturer in academic and industry settings from Stanford to Google, and is co-author of the book Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, anti-racist, non-binary field guide for graphic designers. Their current project, Cripjoy, is a transnational majority BIPOC community of practice focused on reworlding mental health through an intersectional anti-ableist and anti-sanist lens. And I'm really excited to hear more about that. Thank you, Josh. I'm going to disappear for a little while, and when we'll be back all together.
Okay, so I'm going to shift into a different tenor here. I actually have one image. And I figured that since we're going to have a conversation, I wanted to have a conversation with myself and my experiences as a designer, entrance into disability studies, and kind of where that's led me. so far. This screen and the sentence on it will make sense in a little bit. But I will invite you just to kind of come with me and kind of shift into more of kind of an audible presentation here. So I'll take about 15 minutes, I think. So the title of this introduction, and again, it is just an introduction because we're getting into a conversation, is on subject and object in disability and design. It's kind of a cheeky reference to Adorno in 1930 of an essay of a similar name without the disability design tack at the end. And I'll start. So in 2009, I walked into a cold studio classroom with speckled concrete floors and sketches from letterforms pinned to all four walls. This was typography 1 with Leah Hoffmans, a renowned professor at Art Center College of Design, a place where I was getting my undergraduate degree in graphic design. As a student, Leah studied typography with Wolfgang Weingart in Basel, where she painted letters by hand and finagled the spacing between them with an X-Acto blade and tape. This was how she taught us. For 7 weeks, a Winsor Newton paintbrush, a bottle of Plaka emulsion paint, a ruling pen, and a heap of Scotch tape dispensers accompanied me everywhere I went. Even Jones Coffee, a family-owned dive 3 blocks above South Campus at Art Center. My classmates and I were assigned a sequence of letters, Hamburge, as they spelled, Hamburge, with these supplies and an expectation of perfection by midterms. I struggled most with stylizing the arc of the A. Again, I was kind of hand drawing these letter forms. No matter how much I studied this particular curve, my hand and pen could not replicate it, even when using tracing paper. Munga Pachka, Leah sighed, passing by my desk one day. A Yiddish slur for distaste, and for us who know Yiddish, I won't go further into it, but it's not a good thing. Leah continued by scolding, quote, "You are drawing the wrong letter form," unquote. Tracing the empty spaces around the A with her neatly manicured nail, she taught me, quote, "Curves emerge from the space around them. Style the emptiness and you'll find the curve you're looking for," unquote. Before the end of class, I found that curve. And reflecting on this moment, in my history, I also found a theoretical praxis, one that complicated the relation between subject and object, that I wish to bring into conversation here. The curves of letter forms emerge when the typographer acknowledges them as relational with negative space and not a property of any given letter itself. Curves in negative space, subject and object, fold in on and produce each other as a precondition for their legibility and their operability. I'll return to this point, but first, some philosophical context, and I promise this is not too long. The tension between subject and object has propelled philosophical questioning for centuries. On one hand of the dilemma, we have the subject, a conscious and a sentient being, and on the other, the object, entities from which subjects deduce meaning and knowledge. For Plato, Aristotle, and their followers like Kant and Husserl, truth is the correspondence between the subject and object. That is, questions or hypotheses can be answered or become truths, quote unquote, when a subject's ideas about a phenomenon correspond with what can be observed of that phenomenon. For example, the reason we call Newton's, quote, "every action creates an equal and opposite reaction," the third law, rather than the third opinion or the third guess or the third idea, is that subjects can link their control of a bouncing ball, for example, to Newton's claim, thereby validating thought through sight and action. The correspondence theory of truth, as this philosophical project has been named, is transcendental in quality. It seeks, that is, to identify intellectual coordinates that describe and prevail over the life world. Discourse of what disability is, quote unquote, in relation to design typically follows this view, this kind of philosophical project. So I'll swivel into disability studies here. First wave disability studies taught that disability is produced socially through things like material, cultural, and psychological forces that become interlocutors. In other words, disability as product. The rampless storefront, the stigmatic stare, the captionless film, or Zoom conference have a productive quality that is the, quote, essence, quote, of disability. Concerning subject-object relations following this reasoning, disability as product presumes the separation and further the domination of object over subject. Seeking to shift away from institutional and individualized testimonies of their and our, I'll include myself, lives and worth, disabled people inside and outside of the academy have maintained this indispensable and continuing political project. So disability studies as product, a formalized reflection of this view has depended on disability as product, insofar as the knowledge it circulates can be tied back to empirical observations of subject-object domination. We've created histories, we've created rhetoric based on this model. As a disabled person myself, I can account to the ways in which disability is product of objects made for hands. So frankly, most of the world, right? Building on this work and in conversation with more recent conversations of the philosophy of disability as evidenced in Valentine 2021, my conceptualization of disability and design in the classroom, something that I hope to talk about more here, toggles between product and productive. That is to say, in my view, conceiving disability as product limits the ways in which design produces body minds too, in order to exist in the first place. And here's where I'll get into the sentence on the screen here. I'm looking at time, it looks like I have a little bit. In Are We Human? Notes on an Archaeology of Design, Colomina and Wigley present a history of design that loops endlessly between humans and design, like the liar's paradox. This sentence is false, and that's what you see on the screen here. It's a black background and white text in a serif typeface. In this sentence, subject and object move in and out of focus ad infinitum. Describing how this movement occurs, the philosopher of technology, Andrew Feenberg, writes, the statement itself is the actor at the top of the hierarchy, but the object to which it refers is also itself, and in describing itself as false, it reverses the direction of action. I'll explain this in a second. The claim, and this is me, the claim that the statement is false acts as the subject, while the statement itself is the object. But when the reader notices that the object is also the subject, and that the subject is true in its fallacy and false in its truth, subject and object slice into one another in such a way that one gives rise to the other and vice versa. So too, with the history of humans and their objects. Colomina and Wigley examine material forms ranging from stone tools to architecture, showing time and time again how humans shape design and design shapes humans. One notable archaeological study demonstrates how hands and tools co-designed one another, the subject and object deeply entangled in a centuries-long loop. The book's most significant and, I would say, accidental contribution to disability studies in relation to design, in my opinion, is its figure ground take on subject and object, each producing the other in a paradoxical way. Important thinkers have theorized design and technology at the crossroads of subject and object entanglements before, but the human form either appears as diminished or valorized. Heidegger, for example, thought that technology objectified subjects by drawing them into complex technological systems. For example, the logger, the construction worker, the airline attendant become indistinguishable from the saw, the hammer, and the airplane in an ever vacillating loop of objectification. Differing from this grim view, and maybe dystopic view, Haraway saw a bright future in the cyborg in some ways. Its hybridity of flesh, accented by gadgetry, promised an undermining of traditional dichotomies like male-female, human nature, and subject-object. To Haraway, the cyborg represented a new identitarian logic of the future, where Heidegger represents design and technology as a cannibalizing force. Haraway views cannibalization itself as productive. Both Heidegger and Haraway take body minds to be docile in the technology process. A footnote, the critical disability theorist like Hamre, Minich, Kafer, Schock, Frisch, and our very own Bess Williamson contests and often mobilizes, offering histories that, as Marcuse so pointedly wrote in 1969, break the concreteness of oppression in order to open the mental space in which this society can be recognized as what it is and what it does. So on to my last paragraph here before we go into conversation. I wrote this introduction using pen and teeth. This is the same way I wrote myself through a design career, graduate school, and it's the same way that I'm writing emails every single day as an educator, right? My jet black flare tip pen has scarred my 2 teeth and created a small cut in order to fit more comfortably between them. From the moment I learned how to draw curves in Leah Hofwitz's class, subject and object have cut into one another in my body, mind, and theoretical praxis, and I would say pedagogical practice, in relation to design. They are now, as they have always been, indistinguishable from one another. As you continue to listen to this conversation on access by design, I ask you to notice the body minds too, often out of frame, that render designs as functional and dysfunctional. How is your body mind interacting with and contorted by the objects around you in this moment? Where does the line between subject, yourself, and object reside? This question for me and disability design theory is of great importance to the question of history and futurity. Acknowledging temporality too does not fit smoothly into any dyadic divide. So with this, I'll turn back to the dialectic here between Bess, Riva, Jen, and myself. Again, Bess, my deepest congratulations to you and the liberatory contributions that your work provides to us in our studies and our lives. It really evidences what we have always known and felt could be possible. So thanks again.
Thank you, Josh. And I'll ask Riva and Jen, you can put your cameras on too, and we'll all end up on this screen together, I think. Yes, here we are all moving in. And I just want to take like a minute to pause here for a moment and kind of think our way through the 3 talks that we just heard, which I was just really excited by how different they were and the ideas that you all are bringing to the table, but they also, they prompted like a few thoughts of reflection that that I sort of jotted down and that I'll share, but I also want to invite questions and comments as well. So while people are kind of thinking those and typing them into the Q&A box, I will share some thoughts as well. So, you know, as a design historian, I have always approached the history of disability in like an extremely nerdy, which is to say kind of like archives, literal kind of way. I mean, in a sense, something that came up at the very end of the morning talks with Mara Mills and Jonathan Stern, they were talking about like, you know, assessing the practices of, and now I can't remember what they call time changes that in like recorded audio and the ways in which blind folks are like speeding up and cutting up and skipping around time-wise in audio material, and the ways in which it kind of, it may reveal the gap between the researcher and the historical artifact if you can't listen to a record and like hear the same thing that someone else was hearing. Similarly for me, like I'm often reading design manuals and design instructions and these very technical works that to explain what it is that I'm rambling on about here, that I think resonate with what Josh is talking about, the idea of like disability as a product, as like this static thing to like deal with, and that design and technology practices have often addressed disability as like something to work on, a problem to solve, whether it's solved well or not, it sort of is the world that we live in. But the kind of contrasts in a sense between like that kind of practical approach as opposed to a critical one or simply a lived experience version of the world is one that is sort of at the heart of what I'm often working on. So I was thinking, I've been thinking through, as I've mentioned to Riva a few times, like it's been really striking reading her memoir and thinking about this school of like the kind of gulf between art and like design. In a sense, right? The difference between your home ec classroom where you were not taught, with one like really wonderful, rare exception that you talk about in your book, the kind of joys of cooking and sewing and the ways that they might have like helped you create your own style or fit your own clothes or cook for your loved ones, but that they approached it sort of like as a letter, like the letter of the law, or like as a set of instructions. It called to mind for me, I've been teaching 2 disability studies classes this semester, which is always great because then I'm reading a lot all the time with my students, but I noticed like how many people so often refer to Neil Marcus's writing. Neil Marcus, a writer and playwright and activist who just died recently at the end of last year, who wrote, disability is, I'm paraphrasing here, disability is not a burden or a tragedy, but an art form and an ingenious way to live. And it calls to mind for me of like what design often misses, which is like the ingenious way to live part of everyday life that design makes. Further, also made me think of Alison Kafer's writing about disability and technology, responding to Donna Haraway, among others, that I was at a conference, like a mini conference at Microsoft, which Meryl Alper was hosting. I think Meryl is in the audience today. And Alison ultimately just sort of said to all these like tech researchers, like, we're looking for a technology that loves disabled people, right? Rather than a technology that like accommodates or like fixes a problem, but instead really comes from that place. And it, that I guess resonated to me, Josh, with what you're saying about seeing disability as productive, but also these other representations that Jen and Riva, that you are bringing out as well, and sort of the problem of representation as well. So these are just some of my random thoughts. I think the question that I might ask you, we're all teachers and we all have been students at various times. And I wondered if you might share a little bit of like further thoughts about representation, because, Jen, it really struck me that you're like searching for a different representation of neurodiversity. Like, what does it look like? And I just wonder if you all would like to share, like, in a sense, like, what are representations that you think of that sort of work for you, that makes sense? So whether that's in portraiture or in design or in words, in some ways, like, what are some of your reference points? If any of you would like to answer that.
Well, the problem for me is that coming up, there were very, very, very few references on which to sort of start to build an aesthetic. I know that when I first saw Sonora Taylor's portraiture that it was the first time I felt a real kinship with someone who was a portraitist and a painter, and it just completely knocked me out. There are a number of photographers, Gordon Sasaki, Katinka Neuhoff, several others who I think are doing wonderful work with representing our full range of experience, joy and reticence and sorrow and privacy, but a lot of joy. But I wanted to say a couple of things, and then I'll stop. One is that when we're talking about design, one of the things that we really have not talked about is that design is partly functional. You know, does the thing function in the way you want it to, whether it's an object or a piece of information or an aesthetic experience? Does it function the way you want it? But then the other part is, does it give you pleasure? Is it, you know, do you want to be in contact with this thing, to touch it, to look at it, to listen to it? In disability, a lot of times, as we know, those things get severed, that the functional thing or the idea of the functionality is, there's sort of lip service given to whether or not it's a pleasurable object, or it'll be kind of like, let's make it a bright color or something, instead of thinking about what, like affluent design, what's their idea of pleasure? What's the current idea of pleasure in our culture? And Bess and I were talking about something I'd love for us to talk about, but later, which is that I strongly feel that, and I'm actually seeing it in this conference, that visual experience is very demoted in disability culture. That, I mean, most of our academics really are very word-centered. So things that can be communicated verbally are certainly privileged. And that when I was first coming into the culture, as I was going to give a presentation, there would be an audio describer. And I would give my text and my images to an audio describer who was a professional, who the idea was that they knew what people, or we assumed they knew, what people who were low or no vision needed out of a description. And that there were headsets so that if that was something you needed for your access, you would have a direct link. It was incumbent upon the presenter to give what they needed, but now it's shifted to, and I think this is indicative of our culture, that there are almost no professional audio describers anywhere that I go, except at movies occasionally. The presenter is expected to describe their own work, which, if you compare an academic doing a verbal presentation versus someone giving a visual presentation, it can cut your time in half. And you don't know whether you're providing what they need. And if you are expected to do audio descriptions, it's hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of unpaid work that someone doing a verbal presentation does not have to do. So I feel that we are not looking at this, that people who have visual needs need to be able to know that if they're going to get described information, it's appropriate to the current practice, and that people presenting visual information have the ability to twin their ideas along with their visuals. And, you know, we're all dealing with visual stuff. And I think, is this in part this problem of pleasure, that we keep being pushed because of inaccessibility to have to go to function? Because if we don't have function, we are screwed. And so the pleasure of the sensual in all forms keeps getting, I think, drop kicked. So that's my thought.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you,
Thanks,
Lisa.
yeah, thank you so much. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was gonna say, for me, the representation like really kind of comes in all forms, especially like growing up, masking my cognitive disability and my cognitive difference and not necessarily seeing that appreciated or validated like in like the academic space, and not necessarily seeing that in my educators. So I didn't really have I didn't feel like I had enough representation from other disabled professors where I grew up in Maryland. And even in grad school, I just felt like, as Riva was saying and Josh was saying, like the only way that I'm going to be respected and treated as an equal is if I produce a product, and if my body itself like is contributing something to like the design aesthetic, when in sense Black folks have always had their own kind of like aesthetic, their own way of existing, their own way of like embodying their own purpose. That is like a huge lineage of our ancestors, Harriet Tubman, Fannie Lou Hamer, Audre Lorde, bell hooks, who have always been breaking the rules, and who have always been forming their own kind of pleasure activism, Adrienne Maree Brown and their teachings have been really influential to me. And when it comes to, right, like pleasure versus function, and making sure that we're honoring ourselves with that pleasure, with the work that we produce, period. But understanding that collective joy and disability joy is going to come in making sure that we feel like we can be in this together, being that representation that we didn't often get when we were younger, when we were, kind of up and coming, emerging disabled artists. And I still feel like I'm searching for that representation, which is why I am a part of these kinds of conversations, to let people know, hey, like, I see you, I am you, like, let's create, let's co-create together, because we're speaking so much of the same language. So the artwork of course, like Sins Invalid, Cella Man, a lot of these folks, who are, designers of color, artists, creatives of color that are coming up with their own radical ways of, visibility, and radical ways of representing what we often don't see, or what we felt like we couldn't really show unless it was just for our people,
Thanks so much. Josh, I want to give you the mic for just a second. I just want to mention, we just have a few minutes left. So if there's any burning thoughts or comments or questions, please post them in the Q&A. But I'm also happy to hear from you all up here on the stage, so to speak. Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think so. It's a good question, and I think of it two ways. The traditional way of like representation, right, is like what's not represented and making sure that those gaps are filled in some way, shape, or form. Part of how I do that as an educator is to kind of introduce disability histories as design histories. It was funny, I think in 2018, Riva, you were in Berkeley giving a lecture, and Neil Marcus actually, came up to me and said, "Hey, I'm an artist. What do you do?" I said, "I'm a graphic designer." He's like, "Oh, cool. You should come over to my house and hang out." So it started, a years-long friendship, where I would go over and he'd show me special effects zine. And as a graphic designer, I'm one like, this looks a lot like David Carson and the kind of explosion of typography and sense making and, the kind of rational logic of, Western graphic design that I learned. And I started to ask, well, why did I never learn it? Right. I mean, that answer wasn't too hard, but that history was something that I wrote into extra bold and something that I introduce in my class, right. To kind of make sure that we have disability kind of cultural representations and kind of material encounters as design history. And that kind of leads to the second way I think about it, which is, the representation, but also presentation, where I gave a lecture 2 weeks ago and I gave it in kind of the quad area of campus, and made sure that I was speaking specifically to kind of the material conditions of our campus, and kind of, you know, relating the talk that I was giving not to anything on a screen, but to the thing that they, you know, my students inhabit every single day. So they have the framework that I have when I, you know, critique it and think about it, right? So that can be a living and breathing representation that they can take with them beyond the class.
So I think I should wrap us up here. Thank you all again so much. And I do want to like plug each of you. And since I like have my home office here, I can do so and just say like how much all of your work has meant to me. So whether it's Riva's memoir, Gollum Girl, which has some of the best like art reproductions in it of many of a kind of standard size book, and the book that Jen mentioned, the Black Experience in Design, that it was really exciting for me to see. I mean, there's a lot in there, but and such a needed book, but that it has your work in it. And Extra Bold is in my office, but I want to plug Extra Bold as like this sort of pluralistic design book, but it has what I really think is like probably the best like 10 pages of disability studies for designers that is like concise and varied. And I've already taught it like several semesters, which has only been out for a year, but I've already taught it for several semesters. And I just, for design educators and faculty who are out there, really recommend that selection. Reads really well for people who have like not had, particularly who haven't had much of a background in there. That these really like just give us so much to look at and think about. And Riva, I just want to, we don't have time to have like the long discussion about this, but I want to acknowledge your comment about audio description and about image description. And I think it raises like, I think some really interesting questions. I mean, my take tends to be a little more like optimistic, which is that describing our images pushes us to name things that that the art world often assumes that everyone's seeing the same thing, like sort of cognitively as well as visually. And that because to me, it's been like a helpful way to sort of, I mean, this is like a harsh word to use on myself, but just like sort of discipline myself to really like look at what I'm looking at. But I also acknowledge like, you know, it is a labor, and I'm thinking now much more about what would that mean to like take that labor on myself instead of recognizing it as a professional skill that should be provided the same way that we provide captioning and sign interpretation. So on that note, let's acknowledge our signers and our captioners. Thank you for your work as well. And thank you so much, BARD folks as well. And Catherine, I'll hand it to you to finish us out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bess. And also thank you so much for all of our presenters and interlocutors today, and Riva Lara and Jen White Johnson and Joshua Halstead. You've added so much to this discussion. And I think sort of the questions you've raised about the paradigms of historical research and design practice and activism, and this whole kind of notion of solving a problem versus maybe in concert with is a better way to say it. These questions as an art form of ingenuity and a way to live. And the invocation of joy, sorrow, pleasure, and love, I think is really profound. I would like to close from a few comments from our audience, which I think are pretty great. And one is, thank you so much for this fab forum, which I don't think anybody could say any better. And then I think also this kind of thank you for sharing, right, your work with us and this important conversation. And thank you on behalf of Bard Graduate Center for joining us all, for all of us joining us today. So much appreciation and gratitude. Thank you.